Hello, my dear friends. They smelled of smoke, sweat, and survival, yet believed themselves clean. Behind the stone walls of medieval towns, women lived with filth so constant it became invisible. They washed with ashes, wiped with straw, and wore clothes that never met water for months. What they called purity was often decay disguised as routine. Beneath layers of wool and fear, their bodies told a truth no one dared to face. Tonight, we step quietly into their world and see what clean truly meant in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter the dim chambers of a medieval home, the first thing to notice would not be the flickering light from the hearth, but the heavy smell that clung to the air. It was the smell of fabric worn too long, of linen that had soaked in days of sweat and warmth. Under the many layers of wool and rough cloth, women wore simple undergarments made from coarse fabric that rubbed against the skin. These garments were not the soft, delicate pieces one might imagine today. They were stiff, itchy, and poorly fitted, because they were uncomfortable to remove and wash. Many women simply kept them on for days, sometimes even weeks. Washing was a rare event, and replacing garments was rarer still. It is almost ironic that something meant to protect the body became one of the filthiest things on it. Medieval underwear was designed less for comfort and more for convenience. The so-called split crotch design allowed women to relieve themselves without undressing, a necessity in times when layers of skirts, laces, and aprons took effort to remove. But that same convenience came with unpleasant consequences. The fabric remained damp from sweat and moisture, trapping heat against the skin. Without frequent washing, it became a perfect environment for bacteria and irritation. What was meant to be practical soon turned into a breeding ground for infection. Yet, the idea of changing or cleaning such garments daily would have seemed absurd. Soap was expensive, water had to be carried by hand, and the cold of winter made washing unbearable. For many, discomfort was simply a part of life. The coarse weave of the fabric scratched against the skin, leaving marks that never quite healed. Some women tried to soften their garments with animal fat or oil, but that only added another layer of grease and odour. There were no perfumes strong enough to hide the smell. The air in homes was thick with smoke, sweat, and unwashed fabric. It clung to bodies and walls alike. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like wearing the same gym clothes for a month and calling it modesty. In the crowded towns where women worked long hours, the scent of labour mixed with the scent of old cloth became part of the atmosphere, something so ordinary that no one questioned it. Undergarments were rarely seen, and for that reason, they were rarely cared for. What could not be seen did not matter. Women took pride in their outer garments, in fine embroidery or clean aprons, but beneath the layers, the fabric told another story. The seams collected dust, and the folds trapped sweat. The thought of washing such pieces daily was unrealistic when even bathing was considered dangerous or excessive. Water was often associated with sickness, and wet fabric took days to dry in the damp climate. It was far easier to simply let the garments air out near the fire or sprinkle herbs over them to disguise the smell. Some women placed lavender or thyme inside their chests of clothing, believing the scent alone would drive away disease. They did not know that the disease was already resting in the cloth itself. Laundry days were dreaded. Buckets of water had to be heated over open flames, mixed with ashes or lye to scrub out stains. The harsh mixture burned hands and ruined fabric. Many women had only 1 or 2 sets of undergarments, so washing one meant waiting half a day for it to dry. During that time, they went without or wore outer skirts directly against their skin. The discomfort was so common that it was not even spoken of. Mothers passed down these habits to daughters, who continued them out of necessity. To be clean was a luxury reserved for the rich, and even they struggled to maintain it. Maids boiled linens, beat them with sticks, and dried them in smoky air. Clean or not, everything carried the same dull grey smell of the age. What makes it strange to modern eyes is how this routine existed without question. People lived among dirt, yet sought holiness in prayer, as if the cleanliness of the soul could excuse the state of the body. There is something quietly tragic about a world where comfort was sacrificed not out of neglect, but out of survival. The women did not choose filth, they simply had no choice. Warmth mattered more than hygiene, modesty more than comfort. Each garment became a small prison of fabric, trapping the realities of a harsh life beneath the illusion of normality. The stains that marked the fabric were not just from sweat or labor. Menstruation, childbirth, and daily toil all left traces that no amount of washing could remove. Each mark was a record of endurance. When garments became too worn or foul, they were not thrown away but cut into rags for cleaning or bandages. Nothing was wasted. Even filth had to serve a purpose. The very concept of daily change was foreign to most women, whose days revolved around survival. Cleanliness was fleeting, something for feast days or special occasions. In between, the same linen continued to absorb the life of its wearer. To imagine the daily discomfort is to understand the limits of their world. Skin constantly rubbed raw beneath coarse fabric, layered over bodies already exhausted by labor and malnutrition. The warmth that the clothing provided in winter also trapped moisture and odor, making the act of dressing itself a kind of burden. In dimly lit rooms, the air heavy with unwashed bodies. Even the smallest gust from an open door must have felt like relief. The line between necessity and neglect blurred until they became the same thing. Still, people believed that as long as the outer appearance was proper, all was well. The sight of a neatly tied apron or freshly brushed hair meant respectability, even if underneath, the garments told another truth. The illusion of order comforted them, much as it does in any age. The undergarments, unseen and unspoken, carried the hidden weight of daily hardship. They were both shield and burden, preserving modesty while trapping decay. The body beneath endured it in silence, as if to complain would be an act of vanity. Cleanliness of the flesh was a minor concern when the struggle was to keep warm, to eat, and to survive another day. The irony is that the filth they endured was not a reflection of carelessness, but of endurance itself. In the dim rooms and narrow streets, their linen told the story of a life lived between necessity and discomfort, between propriety and decay. The unwashed garments of medieval women were less a choice than a symbol of how little control they had over the conditions of their lives. They lived each day in the same rough fabric, mistaking endurance for cleanliness. In time, the smell and texture became part of who they were. Yet beneath those layers lay a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The neglect of the body would lead to other habits, far stranger and far more dangerous than simply wearing the same clothes for too long. The quiet routines of medieval women often hid the most uncomfortable realities, and few were as harsh as how they managed their bleeding days. Without access to cloth or absorbent materials made for comfort, many turned to what was easily found around them: straw, dry grass, or small tufts of hay were gathered, sometimes softened slightly by hand and pressed between two layers of fabric. These makeshift pads were coarse, fragile, and often painful. The sharp ends of straw scratched against the skin, leaving irritation that could last long after the bleeding stopped. It was not uncommon for women to sit still for long hours to avoid movement, because each step might shift the rough padding out of place. It is almost absurd to imagine that something used for animal bedding became the only protection available to half of society. Hygiene during menstruation was not considered a matter of health, but one of modesty. Women were expected to conceal the evidence, not to care for themselves. There were no fastenings or secure cloth bands to keep the straw in place. When walking, the crude padding could fall loose, so some women tied layers of linen tightly around their hips, while others simply endured the risk. The discomfort was accepted, even when it caused sores or rashes. The idea of cleanliness during bleeding was complicated by superstition. Many believed that menstrual blood was impure or even dangerous, capable of spoiling food or withering crops. Women in their cycle were kept from cooking, from touching certain objects, and often from sleeping near their husbands. The combination of shame and necessity forced them to improvise in silence. The texture of straw against skin was unforgiving. It scraped and poked, causing small cuts that easily became infected. Washing was rare, and clean water was scarce. Once used, the bloodied straw was often buried or burned behind the house, as if disposing of a cursed thing. No one spoke of it. Mothers passed the practice to daughters quietly, the same way they passed recipes or sewing skills, but with less pride. It was not a subject for conversation, not even among women. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like using shredded newspaper in place of sanitary pads and pretending it was normal. Pain was accepted as part of womanhood, something to be endured rather than solved. The lack of proper hygiene turned each menstrual cycle into a source of dread. The damp warmth between layers of cloth and straw created perfect conditions for infection. Without soap or antiseptic, the smallest wound could fester. Some women tried to ease the soreness by rubbing animal fat or herbs on the skin, believing the smell would drive away illness. It rarely helped. The mixture of sweat, blood, and straw produced an odor that lingered long after the bleeding ended. Clothes absorbed it, bedding carried it, and it became another quiet burden of daily life. No one called it unsanitary because few understood what that meant. Illness was common, and no one thought to connect it with their own habits. Religion and tradition played their part in keeping this suffering invisible. Church teachings labelled menstruation as unclean, but offered no guidance for comfort or hygiene. To speak of it was to risk embarrassment or judgment. Women prayed for their cycles to pass quickly, hiding away when they could, continuing their work when they could not. Fields were tended, meals prepared, and children cared for, even while pain and irritation persisted beneath their skirts. The rhythm of life did not pause for discomfort. Each woman carried her private misery in silence, knowing that everyone else did the same. The rare few who had access to finer materials, linen, wool scraps, or soft moss, guarded them carefully. These were washed and reused until they fell apart. Straw, by contrast, was disposable but cruel. It scratched the skin raw, left marks, and offered little protection from staining. The sight of a blood mark on clothing could bring humiliation, even punishment, as women were expected to appear pure and composed at all times. The body's natural function became something to conceal, not something to understand. The simplicity of straw made it practical, but its cruelty made it unforgettable. Those who could afford better avoided it. Those who could not had no other choice. In winter, when hay was scarce and wet, women used dry reeds or old cloth stuffed with herbs. The result was often the same pain, rash, and infection. No doctors were willing to discuss such issues, and few women dared to ask. Bleeding was a reminder of weakness in a world that demanded endurance. The straw solution was not an invention of ignorance, but of survival. It reflected the same logic that made people drink from dirty wells or sleep beside fires that filled their homes with smoke. They did what they had to do to live through each season, regardless of the cost. The silence surrounding this practice is what makes it so haunting. There are no records written by the women themselves, only fragments from household manuals or moral guides written by men. These books mention cleanliness in vague, moral tones, but never in physical detail. The reality was too intimate, too unworthy of record. Generations of women managed their bodies with materials meant for animals and dirt, and the world considered it proper. There is something deeply sad about how pain was treated as a form of virtue. To suffer quietly was to be a good woman, and good women did not complain about the things that bled beneath their dresses. In the rare moments of rest, some might sit near the hearth and warm their skirts, letting the heat dry what the cold had made unbearable. Others burned herbs or incense to cover the smell, pretending that it was simply the scent of daily life. Each gesture spoke of resignation, not comfort. These women carried on with grace that history rarely acknowledges. Their endurance, hidden behind layers of fabric and straw, tells more about their strength than any poem or portrait could. They managed their pain with straw and silence, and the world mistook that endurance for purity. The act of hiding became their habit, the discomfort their companion. Yet in that quiet endurance lay the seeds of worse practices, as the quest to appear clean would soon lead them to far more dangerous methods than straw and cloth. In medieval life, blood was not only a sign of injury, but also a symbol of sin. When it came from women, it carried meanings that went beyond the body. Menstruation was not seen as natural or necessary. It was believed to be proof of weakness, impurity, or divine punishment. Women who bled were told they were unclean, that their touch could corrupt food, their breath could spoil crops, and their presence could drive away blessings. The same cycle that marked health in a woman's body was treated as a mark of shame. It is grimly amusing that a society obsessed with purity believed its filth came from the people who cleaned its homes and raised its children. During their bleeding days, women were quietly pushed to the edges of community life. They were asked to stay away from churches, from prayer, and from holy objects. Some households even made them eat separately or sleep apart. The belief was that their impurity might offend God or anger the saints. In monasteries and villages alike, these customs were followed with silent obedience. There was no question, only repetition. Generations grew up hearing that menstruation made a woman dangerous, that she could spread illness or bring misfortune just by existing. Such fear sank deep into ordinary thinking until it became as natural as the passing of the seasons. The isolation was not enforced by violence, but by habit. Women learned to disappear for a few days each month, retreating from work or worship when they could. In crowded towns, they would still cook and clean, but carefully avoided touching others. When they entered a church, they might kneel at the back. eyes lowered, fearful that anyone would notice. Shame was woven into the rhythm of their bodies. To be born a woman meant to carry that burden in silence. If one compares it to modern times, it would be like treating every woman with a cold as if she were contagious with sin. The ignorance was not simply religious, it was cultural, carried forward by priests, physicians, and family elders alike. Texts written by male scholars described menstruation as a kind of illness. They believed the female body was weaker, constantly needing to purge itself of bad blood. Some even claimed that menstrual blood was poisonous, that it could turn wine sour or rust metal. These words, printed and preached, gave authority to superstition. Women believed it too, not because they lacked sense, but because their world left them no reason to doubt. When the church spoke, it was the truth. When men wrote, it was law. The result was generations of women who felt disgust toward their own bodies, who hid their pain and blood as though it were proof of wrongdoing. Inside homes, the silence was complete. Mothers did not explain menstruation to daughters until it happened, and when it did, the message was simple: stay quiet, stay away, stay clean. There were no kind words, no reassurance. The fear of being seen as unholy overpowered any chance for comfort. Girls learned to hide stains, to wash in secret, to burn or bury the cloths they used. They prayed that no one would notice. Men, in turn, preferred not to think about it at all. To acknowledge the reality of a woman's body was considered indecent. The result was a shared silence that stretched across generations, holding women captive inside their own skin. The irony was that these customs had little to do with hygiene. They were rituals of control disguised as morality. The church taught that the cleanliness of the soul mattered more than the body, yet it made women feel that their bodies were beyond redemption. Some confessed their bleeding as if it were a sin. Others fasted, hoping to purify themselves through suffering. There was no place for understanding, only obedience. It is unsettling to realize how often virtue has been used to disguise fear. By labeling women as unclean, society made it easier to justify their exclusion from sacred spaces, from education, and from authority. The cost was their dignity, paid monthly in silence. In villages, whispers followed women who broke the rules. A woman seen near a well or a bakery during her bleeding days might be blamed if food spoiled or livestock sickened. Misfortune always found a scapegoat, and the blame always seemed to find its way to women. Even when nothing happened, the superstition persisted. It was easier to keep believing than to question a rule older than memory. The few who did question it were dismissed as strange or sinful. Some healers tried to argue that menstruation was healthy, that it balanced the body, but their voices were drowned by the chorus of priests who warned against impurity. The most painful part was not the restriction itself, but how deeply it shaped identity. Women grew up believing that they were unclean by nature, that their blood was shameful, that silence was virtue. They carried that belief into marriage, motherhood, and death. The idea that a woman could be holy and bleeding at the same time was unthinkable. Even saints were rewritten to fit the ideal of purity, their suffering scrubbed clean of anything too human. The body became a battlefield between faith and reality, and faith always won. In time, these ideas would soften, but their echo remained. The fear of blood turned into disgust, and disgust into silence. The centuries built a wall between women and their own bodies, one that would take far longer to wash away than any stain on cloth. In the medieval world, Purity was not a state of being, but an act of constant denial. To be called clean was to have erased oneself. The cost of that erasure was invisible, but immense. They lived in bodies that were condemned by their own society, quietly carrying the weight of its judgment. The silence around their blood was a silence around their worth, yet from that silence would later emerge defiance, as the need to be seen would grow stronger than the fear of being judged. The same blood once called impure would eventually become a symbol of survival in a world that refused to see it. In the medieval world, the act of bathing was not a habit, but a suspicion. Water was both feared and misunderstood, seen as a substance that could cleanse the soul but destroy the body. Most people believed that washing the whole body was dangerous, that it invited sickness by opening invisible doors in the skin. To immerse oneself in water was to risk weakness or death. Instead, they focused on what was visible: a clean face, a rinsed hand, or a wiped neck was enough to appear respectable. The rest could remain hidden beneath layers of cloth. It is almost comical to think that avoiding water was once considered a way to stay healthy. The fear had roots in medicine and religion alike. Physicians of the time claimed that water softened the flesh, making it vulnerable to bad air or miasma, which they thought carried disease. Priests echoed the warning, reminding people that indulgence in comfort led to sin. Cleanliness of the body was secondary to cleanliness of the soul. Bathing too often was even seen as prideful, a sign of vanity or lust. Women, especially, were told to be modest and endure the natural scent of labor and fabric. To wash too much was to draw attention to the self, and attention was dangerous. So, they washed only their faces and hands, wiping away dirt, but not the residue of daily life that clung to their bodies like a second skin. The typical wash was a quiet ritual. A basin of cold water sat on a wooden table, a piece of cloth beside it. Women dipped the fabric, wrung it out, and dabbed it on their cheeks or wrists. The sensation was sharp, bracing, and fleeting. It did not clean so much as it reminded them of what they were avoiding. The rest of the body, covered in linen and wool, was left untouched for weeks. The odour became part of life, rising with the heat of the day and absorbed into everything they wore. If one compares it to today, it would be like believing that washing your face after running a marathon made you fully clean. The illusion of freshness was enough to satisfy both conscience and custom. Public baths existed in some towns, but they carried a reputation of immorality. To bathe with strangers was seen as indecent, even sinful. The few who dared to visit were often judged harshly. For women, the idea was even more scandalous. A modest woman avoided exposure at all costs. Instead, she relied on perfumes, herbs, or scented oils to mask the smell of unwashed skin. The scent of lavender, rose water, or vinegar mixed with the scent of labour, forming the perfume of the age. Water, the simplest cleanser of all, was replaced by complicated rituals of avoidance. People wiped themselves with cloths, sprinkled their hair with powders, and prayed that this was enough to keep illness away. In the countryside, bathing meant more than comfort, it meant survival. Carrying water from wells or rivers was heavy work, and heating it required firewood that was often too valuable to waste. The poor could not afford to boil water just to bathe. Even when they could, they hesitated. Steam was thought to weaken the lungs, and warm water to invite fever. They cleaned what others could see, and left the rest to time. Children were washed more often than adults, not for health, but for appearance, since visitors judged a household by the faces of its young. The rest of the family lived in a quiet truce with filth pretending not to notice its presence. The fear of water also shaped architecture. Homes had no baths, only basins. The idea of a dedicated room for washing was unheard of. Rivers were for laundry, not for people. To bathe fully was to stand in the open, exposed to the world, and that vulnerability felt unnatural. It was easier to stay dry, to trust in faith rather than water. This belief persisted even during times of plague, when dirt covered the living and the dead alike. Instead of washing, people burned incense or carried herbs, convinced the scent would protect them from sickness. In truth, it only layered one kind of decay over another. For women, this avoidance became part of their identity. Clean faces symbolized virtue, while unwashed bodies represented humility. It was a way of saying, "I am pure where it matters." They wiped their hands before prayer, their faces before confession, believing that small gestures of cleanliness reflected inner goodness. They did not question why sickness and filth still clung to them, because to question tradition was to defy order. It is strange to think that survival once depended on the refusal to be clean. Yet in their minds, the danger of water was greater than the discomfort of dirt. To remain unbathed was not laziness, but caution, a kind of discipline shaped by fear. In the dark of winter, when the air turned bitter and the hearth smoke hung low, the thought of washing grew even more distant. Cold water burned the skin, and the idea of undressing was unbearable. Sweat, soot, and oil built up layer by layer until the body itself seemed armored against the world. Those who did wash fully often did so only once or twice a year, marking holy days or special occasions. The rest of the time, they lived within their own smell, neither proud nor ashamed of it. It was simply the scent of life continuing. The refusal to bathe did not make people ignorant, only cautious in a world that punished curiosity. Water was beauty and danger in equal measure, a gift from nature that could just as easily destroy. They feared it as they feared illness, both invisible and unpredictable. Cleanliness came to mean something moral, not physical. A clean conscience replaced a clean body, and that was enough to sleep at night. They washed their faces to please others and ignored the rest to protect themselves. In their fear of sickness, they built a culture around avoidance and disguise. Yet the dirt they feared to touch would soon return in another form, creeping into their homes and their flesh in ways far worse than a bowl of cold water could ever cause. Bathing in medieval households was a ritual of necessity rather than cleanliness. Most families owned only one wooden tub, rough and shallow, placed near the fire when the time came to wash. The act was not a daily one, nor even a weekly one. When it did occur, the same water served everyone, poured and reheated as it grew colder. The first to step in was always the head of the family, followed by others in order of rank or age. By the time the last person bathed, the water was cloudy, greasy, and filled with whatever had come off the bodies before. It is almost absurd to imagine that the path to cleanliness began with soaking in someone else's dirt. The idea of separate baths was foreign to most people. Heating enough water for one person was difficult enough, let alone for many. Firewood was precious, and water had to be carried from wells or streams. Once poured into the tub, it could not be wasted. So, the family shared it, often in silence, each waiting for their turn as steam filled the dim room. The smell of wet wool and smoke mixed with the scent of old sweat rises from the surface. The water, once clear, turned grey after the first body, brown after the second, and black by the time the servants and children took their turn. For them, bathing was less a cleansing than an endurance. The tub itself was heavy and cracked with age. It sat on the floor, sometimes lined with straw to keep it steady. Water sloshed over the edges as each person stepped in and out, leaving the floor slick with grime. The first bather might scrub with a rough cloth. The next would settle for a quick rinse. No soap was used, only warm water or a handful of herbs meant to sweeten the smell. It was a brief illusion of freshness before the reality of filth returned. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like a whole household using the same bathwater for days and calling it luxury. In truth, it was survival disguised as routine. The order of bathing told much about the world's hierarchy. Men went first, women next, and children or servants last. Cleanliness followed rank. Those at the bottom were left with water that stung the skin and carried the residue of everyone before them. Children sat quietly as their mothers poured it over their heads, whispering warnings not to splash. Servants, if allowed at all, waited until the house had gone quiet, washing in the same murky water under fading candlelight. By then, the warmth had vanished, and the tub was little more than a cold pool of fatigue. Still, it was better than nothing. To bathe, even in filth, felt like a small act of care. The water told stories as it cooled. Floating hairs, bits of soap, and pieces of straw drifted across the surface. Dirt settled at the bottom, coating the wood like paint. Once emptied, the tub was left to dry in the corner, often without being scrubbed. It would be used again the next time someone felt brave enough to face the chill of washing. The smell lingered long after the water was gone, mixing with the smoke from the fire and the scent of damp clothes drying nearby. Cleanliness, as they understood it, was not about purity, but about effort. The act of bathing itself was enough to feel renewed, even if the result was doubtful. This practice reflected more than poverty. It reflected belief. People thought that the water itself could carry disease, that to change it too often was wasteful or even dangerous. Warm water was believed to draw out illness, to make the body weak. Reheating the same water, adding a little fresh water to it, felt safer. The logic was simple and flawed, yet it persisted for centuries. It made sense in a world where resources were scarce and superstition filled the gaps that knowledge could not reach. It is hard not to feel uneasy, knowing that the same water meant for cleansing might have spread the very sickness they feared. But fear was stronger than reason, and routine was stronger than fear. Bathing nights were noisy affairs in small cottages. Steam rose to the ceiling while family members moved about, preparing clean clothes or waiting their turn. The sound of splashing mixed with laughter, sighs, or the soft cries of children chilled by cold air. It was one of the few moments of pause in a harsh life, and even in its discomfort. There was something communal about it. Families shared not just water but exhaustion, privacy, and warmth. When the fire dimmed and the last bather finished, the dirty water was dumped outside, where it steamed faintly against the cold ground. The next morning, they would wake and dress again, wrapped in layers that quickly hid any trace of cleanliness. For most, the smell of the bath lingered in their hair and clothes, a sour blend of wood smoke and skin. No one noticed. Everyone smelled the same. To smell of soap or rose water was to invite envy or suspicion, luxuries reserved for the wealthy. The poor had no such illusions. Clean or dirty, they still faced the same mud, the same air thick with dust and ash. Bathing did not separate them from filth. It only reminded them that it could never be escaped entirely. They did not seek purity, only a brief moment of warmth and the feeling of having done what little they could. They shared the same water, because life gave them little else to share. In that single wooden tub, families lived the paradox of trying to wash away dirt by immersing themselves in it. The act was more ritual than hygiene, more hope than result. Yet, as habits hardened into beliefs, the line between what cleansed and what contaminated blurred completely. It was a small comfort in a world where comfort rarely existed, but that comfort would soon give rise to another kind of danger, one that came not from water left unclean, but from the scents and herbs they used to hide it. The scent of medieval life was heavy and inescapable. In crowded streets and small homes, the air itself seemed to carry the weight of unwashed bodies, smoke, and earth. Bathing was rare, so people turned to what nature offered them to mask the smell of living: leaves of bay, sprigs of lavender, or crushed herbs were tucked into clothing, pinned inside hats, or tied around the neck in small bundles. These were not luxuries but necessities, small shields against the odour of daily existence. A faint floral scent drifting from a sleeve or collar gave the illusion of cleanliness, even when the skin beneath had not touched water for weeks. It is almost humorous that people trusted a handful of flowers to do the work of soap. The practice began out of both superstition and desperation. Doctors warned that bad air spread sickness, so the goal was not to wash the body, but to disguise its smell. Women placed herbs close to the skin, believing the fragrance would protect them from disease. Bay leaves were said to ward off fevers, rosemary to keep away plague, and lavender to calm the nerves. These beliefs made sense in a world without science. Smell was the enemy, so scent became the weapon. The poor gathered what they could from gardens or fields, while the rich soaked their herbs in wine or vinegar, dabbing the mixture onto their necks and wrists. It stung the skin but offered a momentary freshness that faded long before the day was done. The mixture of sweat and perfume created a strange sweetness, a scent both earthy and sour that filled every corner of life. Women sewed small pockets into their clothes to hold crushed herbs, while men carried pouches scented with mint or thyme. In summer, the heat turned these fragrant bundles into warm pockets of decay, blending with the smell of wool and oil. Yet, to those who lived in it, this aroma was comfort. It meant health, modesty, and respectability. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like replacing deodorant with a handful of potpourri and convincing oneself it was medicine. The illusion of control mattered more than the truth. Lavender was the most beloved of all. It grew easily, dried quickly, and its scent lingered on the skin longer than most. Women tied sprigs into ribbons, slipping them under the bodice or inside their veils. Some soaked linen in lavender water and pressed it to their faces before entering crowded markets, believing it would block bad air. Others mixed herbs with wine, using the liquid to wipe the body where sweat gathered most. The sting of alcohol was seen as proof that it was working. The idea of bacteria or infection was unknown, so they fought the smell instead of the cause. When the scent faded, they simply added more. The cycle repeated endlessly, and so did the illusion of cleanliness. The wealthier households refined this habit into a ritual. Perfumed oils were imported from distant lands, stored in glass bottles that caught the light. Servants prepared mixtures of rose, clove, and vinegar for their mistresses, who applied them to the skin like armour. The result was an overpowering fragrance that filled entire rooms, blending with candle smoke and damp stone. The poor imitated as best they could, crushing wildflowers and mixing them with cheap wine. The fragrance was short-lived, but for a moment It made them feel civilized. The difference between classes was not in hygiene, but in the price of the smell. Beneath these scents, however, the same dirt remained. Sweat soaked into linen, oil clung to hair, and infection spread quietly beneath the perfume. The herbs masked the odour, but not the sickness. Wounds festered under scented cloth, and lice hid in perfumed hair. Still, no one questioned the practice. Cleanliness was not measured by the absence of filth, but by the presence of fragrance. A person who smelled of herbs was considered respectable, even holy. Something is unsettling about how easily humans have always confused beauty with purity. The sweet smell gave a sense of safety, even when it only covered decay. The connection between scent and morality grew strong. Churches burned incense during prayer, nobles perfumed their gloves and hair, and even peasants hung bunches of herbs above their beds. The world was filled with fragrance, but little of it came from true cleanliness. The body itself was hidden, its natural smell treated as something to be conquered. Women, especially, were expected to smell pleasant, even when their daily labour left them covered in sweat and dust. To smell of nothing was to seem alive. To smell of flowers was to seem virtuous. The line between deception and survival blurred completely. In small cottages, the air was thick with layers of scent. Dried lavender hung from beams, bay leaves curled near the hearth, and vinegar jars stood open to absorb the stench of smoke and food. It was an endless battle between odour and illusion. Each breath carried a mixture of both. No one could escape it. They could only manage it. When visitors came, the herbs were freshened, and the strongest smelling jars were brought forward, as if fragrance itself could prove cleanliness. Over time, the use of herbs became not only practical, but symbolic. To wear them was to show care for oneself, to mask the signs of poverty and labour. The smell of sweat became the mark of hardship, while the smell of herbs suggested grace. Women tucked them close to the heart, men fastened them to their cloaks, and together they moved through a world perfumed with denial. The herbs dried quickly, crumbling into dust, but were replaced again and again. What mattered was not that they worked, but that they gave comfort. They hid the odour of life beneath layers of flowers, mistaking fragrance for health. The air they breathed was sweet but heavy with rot, and as they filled their homes and clothes with the scent of herbs, they began to forget what a truly clean body smelled like. Their faith in fragrance would only deepen, driving them to stranger and more dangerous mixtures that promised purity but carried poison instead. True soap was a rarity in the medieval world, a harsh substance reserved not for the body, but for fabric and floors. It was made from animal fat and lye, boiled together in large pots until it formed a thick, caustic paste that could strip grease and colour from anything it touched. The smell alone was unpleasant, sharp and smoky, lingering in the air long after it was made. Few could afford it, and fewer dared to use it on their skin. Those who tried often found their hands raw and their flesh burning. It is almost darkly funny that something invented for cleanliness was too dangerous to clean with. For most people, soap was a tool for work, not for washing. Women used it to scrub stains from linen, to wash pots, and to scour floors darkened by soot. After a long day of labour, the thought of rubbing that same substance on the skin was unthinkable. Water alone, or sometimes a cloth soaked in warm herbs, was the safer choice. Warmth was comfort, scent was luxury, and real soap was both too rough and too precious to waste on the body. A single bar could cost more than a meal. For families counting every coin, the decision was simple. Dirt could be endured, but hunger could not. The body was left to its natural state, covered and forgotten beneath layers of cloth. The wealthy could afford better, though their soap was no gentler. Imported bars from distant lands came scented with oils or flowers, but even these carried the sting of lie beneath the perfume. The upper classes used them sparingly, often more as display than necessity. A scented bar left on a table or wrapped in cloth said more about wealth than cleanliness. Servants prepared bowls of warm water for their mistresses, steeping herbs or crushed petals into the liquid before wiping the skin. The ritual looked refined, but the result was little different from the peasant woman washing her face with water drawn from a well. The illusion of gentleness mattered more than the truth of hygiene. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like buying an expensive cleanser only to use it as decoration on a shelf. Cleanliness was performance, not practice. In villages, soap was made in small quantities when fat and ash were plentiful. The process filled homes with a bitter, acrid smoke that clung to walls and hair. Buckets of rainwater, ashes from the hearth, and scraps of animal fat were mixed in barrels, stirred for hours, and left to harden. The resulting lumps were uneven, greasy, and foul-smelling. They cleaned stains well, but stripped the skin raw. Those who made it often had cracked hands and burned palms, marks of a trade necessary but thankless. When it was ready, the soap was wrapped in cloth and traded at markets, where its worth was measured not by its scent or texture, but by how well it bit through filth. For personal washing, people trusted simpler means. Herbs boiled in water released oils and fragrance that softened the skin without burning it. Women kept jars of dried flowers, mint, or thyme for this purpose. A cloth dipped into the warm mixture became a substitute for the bath they could not afford or dared not take. The scent was fleeting, but it brought a small comfort to lives that offered few. In the absence of soap, these rituals became sacred. Washing was less about removing dirt than about renewing the spirit. A brief moment of calm between endless chores. The church added its own voice to this restraint. Cleanliness was a matter of morality, not of flesh. To seek physical purity was to risk vanity, and vanity was sin. A woman who cared too much for her appearance was warned against pride. The poor obeyed because they had no choice. The rich obeyed because guilt was cheaper than comfort. Soap became both a symbol of temptation and a mark of privilege, desired and despised at the same time. There is something deeply human about fearing the very things that promise relief. The people of that time lived between necessity and superstition, never fully trusting either. The smell of soap was familiar, yet foreign. To catch its scent was to think of laundry day, of smoke rising from the hearth, of skin cracked from scrubbing. It was the smell of effort, not of freshness. A woman who smelled of soap did not smell clean. She smelled of work. For that reason, most preferred the faint perfume of herbs, even if it did nothing to purify. Cleanliness of scent mattered more than cleanliness of skin. The body could remain hidden, its imperfections buried beneath layers of linen and custom. As long as the face looked composed and the clothes seemed tidy, no one cared to ask what lay beneath. In the markets, soap sellers shouted promises of purity, but everyone knew the truth. Their product was harsh and unforgiving, a tool for washing the world but not the self. Still, people bought it when they could, because having soap meant having control, however small. It meant the ability to make something cleaner than before, to fight back against the endless dirt that filled their lives. Even if it burned, it worked. Pain and cleanliness became intertwined until one no longer existed without the other. They feared the sting of soap, yet longed for the peace it symbolized. Between the cruelty of lye and the comfort of herbs, they chose survival, layering scent over sweat and habit over knowledge. But as belief in purity deepened, the urge to cleanse would grow stronger, leading people to stranger methods that promised beauty, but left scars no water could wash away. Oral care in the medieval world was quite a contradiction. People cared about appearances, yet their smiles told another story. Teeth were tools, not features to be admired. They were meant to chew, not to shine. Cleanliness of the mouth, when it was considered at all, was limited to what could be seen and smelled. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. Instead, people began each morning by scraping their tongues with small sticks or pieces of bark, believing that removing the surface coating of residue would keep illness away. The habit was quick, simple, and symbolic, a way to start the day feeling purified without truly being clean. It is almost laughable that they thought polishing the tongue could protect them from decay. The tools they used were primitive and improvised. Some took thin twigs from fragrant trees, stripping the bark until the wood became soft and fibrous. Others used splinters of bone or curved metal pieces if they could afford them. These makeshift scrapers were meant to clear the tongue of the film left by sleep and sour breath. The act did remove some residue, but it did little for the teeth themselves, which remained coated with the evidence of meals and time. Food stuck easily in the gaps, and without any means of removal, it stayed there until it rotted. The smell was inevitable. People accepted it, not because they liked it, but because there was no alternative. Mouthwash, in the sense we understand it today, did not exist. Instead, some rinsed their mouths with wine, vinegar, or salt water. The burning sensation was seen as proof that it worked. Herbs like mint or sage were chewed for freshness, though their effect was brief. The strong flavours merely covered the deeper staleness that came from years of neglect. When they smiled or spoke, a sourness lingered in the air, especially among those whose diets were filled with onions, garlic, or salted fish. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like washing your face every day but never cleaning your teeth once in your entire life. The result was predictable but accepted. Another quiet discomfort in a world already full of them. Teeth darkened early and fell out often. Without understanding decay or infection, most people thought tooth loss was a natural part of aging, a fate shared by everyone. Some tried to strengthen their teeth by rubbing them with ash, salt, or even crushed charcoal. These rough powders scratched the enamel but gave the illusion of cleaning. Others used a cloth dipped in vinegar to wipe their gums, hoping to chase away pain. When teeth ached, remedies were cruel. Heated metal, strong liquor, or even prayer served as the only relief. Extraction was done by anyone brave enough to pull blacksmiths, barbers, or friends. The idea of preventing decay never took hold because decay itself was expected. The wealthy were not much better off, though their decay was scented with luxury. Nobles rinsed with rose water or chewed cloves to mask odour. Some owned small ivory sticks carved for scraping the tongue, objects more ornamental than effective. They smiled through the same pain, their breath perfumed but still foul. Beauty in those days was not tied to the mouth. A fair face could coexist with rotting teeth, as long as one kept quiet. Portraits from the time never showed open mouths. Smiles were rare, not just because of social decorum, but because revealing one's teeth was often embarrassing. Silence hid decay better than any herb could. Superstition filled the gap where knowledge should have been. It was believed that worms caused toothaches, tiny creatures that gnawed at the roots from within. To drive them out, people held burning herbs near their mouths or dripped oil onto the gums. The pain often eased, not because the worms fled, but because the nerves died. The misunderstanding persisted for centuries. blending with folk cures and prayer. Suffering was treated as natural, another form of penance. To have bad teeth was simply to live as others did. There is something strangely human about learning to accept pain when ignorance feels safer than truth. The lack of dental care affected everyone, from peasants to nobles. Children lost baby teeth early and grew up with crooked, stained smiles. Adults ground their teeth on tough bread, often mixed with bits of grit from the millstones. Each meal slowly eroded what little enamel they had. Cavities formed and deepened, gums receded, and infections spread silently through the mouth. When fever came from decay, few realized its source. Illness was blamed on bad air or divine will, never on the small, festering wounds inside their own mouths. Death from infection was not uncommon, though no one called it that. It was simply another form of weakness in a life full of hardship. Despite the decay, vanity persisted in small ways. People loved the smell of herbs and clung to them as signs of refinement. Chewing mint leaves, rinsing with wine, or scraping the tongue became small daily rituals of civility. The poor gathered wild plants for this purpose, while the rich purchased imported spices. The difference was in cost, not in result. Both groups lived with the same bad breath and the same darkened smiles. But the rituals mattered. They made people feel controlled, even if the control was an illusion. The act of scraping the tongue became a gesture of hope, a way to begin each morning with the pretense of purity in a world where nothing stayed clean. Pain was handled with resignation. Toothaches lasted for weeks, and swollen gums were ignored until they burst. Some used pieces of cloth soaked in spirits and pressed against the tooth to dull the agony. Others prayed for relief, or simply endured it in silence. There was little distinction between the ache of a tooth and the ache of hunger or fatigue. Pain was pain, and life was full of it. The line between endurance and neglect blurred until they were the same. Cleanliness of the mouth was a luxury not of money, but of imagination, and few could afford either. Over time, the smell of decay became so common that it was no longer noticed. People stood close, spoke face to face, and breathed each other's air without flinching. They were used to it, just as they were used to smoke-filled homes and soiled clothes. The body adapted to its own filth, and society followed. Only when death came from infection did anyone realize what had been festering beneath their smiles. Yet even then, the cause was rarely understood. The body failed, and faith explained the rest. They scraped their tongues each morning, convinced it was enough. They rinsed with wine and wiped with herbs, carrying on as though the scent of decay were only another part of living. Beneath the surface, rot worked quietly, claiming teeth, gums, and sometimes life itself. But ignorance was merciful. It kept them from fearing what they could not fix, from mourning what they did not understand. The small rituals of cleaning became acts of hope in a world too used to dirt, and as they polished their tongues in vain, they prepared themselves for the next habit born from the belief that beauty could come from pain and purity from poison. The feet of medieval women told the quiet story of their labour. They carried the weight of long days spent walking on uneven ground, standing in cold fields, or moving endlessly through dim kitchens. Shoes were a privilege, not a guarantee. Many went barefoot in summer and wore stiff leather shoes in winter, the kind that rubbed the skin raw and trapped moisture inside. Socks were rare, and soft linings almost unknown. The result was constant discomfort that never truly healed. Cracked heels, hardened soles, and blistered toes became marks of endurance rather than neglect. It is almost ironic that the very parts of the body that kept them moving were given the least care. The materials available for footwear were unforgiving. Leather was tanned with harsh chemicals, often stiff and unyielding. Once shaped into shoes, it offered protection from the earth, but none from pain. The seams cut into the skin, and the soles absorbed water like sponges. Walking through mud or snow meant feeling the chill seep through each step until the skin grew numb. When the shoes dried, they shrank and stiffened again, pressing tighter against the feet. The cycle repeated day after day until the skin split. The cracks filled with dirt, and the dirt hardened like another layer of skin. To clean them was impossible. Warm water was scarce, and soap too harsh to use on flesh already broken. The seasons were cruel to those who had no means of comfort. Summer burned the ground beneath bare feet, leaving calluses so thick they turned grey. Winter brought the opposite cold that bit until the skin broke. Frost cracked the heels open, and infection found its way inside. The pain was sharp but familiar, like the sting of daily labour. A woman with split feet still had to walk, still had to stand, still had to work. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like walking for weeks in shoes 2 sizes too small and calling it duty. They learned to endure rather than to heal. Rest was rare, and healing slower still. Without ointments or salves, they turned to what they had. Animal fat was the most common remedy, melted and rubbed into the skin as a crude moisturizer. It offered a moment of relief, softening the cracks and sealing in warmth. The smell was unpleasant, a mix of smoke and grease, but it was the closest thing to medicine they knew. Some added herbs or ashes, believing it made the mixture stronger. Others wrapped their feet in rags to hold the fat in place overnight. By morning, the cloth would be stiff with residue, and the skin beneath still dry. Yet the ritual continued because it was anything that made the pain bearable. Shoes, when they were new, were treasures to be guarded. Women patched them again and again, sewing with rough thread until the leather could hold no more. A single pair could last years if tended carefully, though comfort faded long before the shoe itself did. Those who could afford better materials, like lined boots or soft slippers, were exceptions. For most, feet were simply instruments of endurance. No one thought of them as delicate or worthy of care. The body below the knees was hidden from view, and what was hidden was forgotten. The cracks, the swelling, the dirt were invisible signs of a life that demanded too much from those who had the least. The poor felt the pain most, but even among the wealthy, foot care was primitive. Noble women wore pointed shoes that deformed their toes, binding fashion to suffering. They moved carefully, pretending grace while hiding discomfort. Beneath the silks and jewels, their feet were as calloused as any servant's. The difference lay only in the coverings. To suffer quietly was considered noble, to show distress was weakness. In that way, vanity and necessity met at the same place, the edge of endurance. The feet, though unseen, carried the burden of status as much as the weight of the body. Religious thinking did little to help. Pain was viewed as purification, and suffering as virtue. Cracked heels and bleeding soles were seen as signs of humility, reminders of mortality. Women were told to accept discomfort as part of their duty, to walk through hardship without complaint. Even pilgrims on holy journeys often marched barefoot as an act of devotion. To bleed was to be blessed, at least in the eyes of faith. Cleanliness, once again, was a luxury sacrifice to moral ideals. There is something quietly tragic about how easily faith turned suffering into obedience. The feet that bled for devotion or poverty were treated the same as symbols of endurance, not as wounds needing care. The smell of unwashed leather and human sweat lingered everywhere. inside cottages, shoes were left near the fire to dry, releasing a sharp odour of damp hide and smoke. The steam that rose from them carried the scent of decay, but no one found it strange. It was the smell of life continuing, of effort repeated. In the mornings, when the shoes were pulled back on, the leather felt rough and cold against the skin. Each step reopened the cracks from the day before. A dull ache followed them through work and prayer, through hunger and fatigue. It was not pain to be spoken of, it was simply there, like the weight of clothing or the rhythm of breath. Children suffered the same fate, often walking barefoot until they were old enough to work. Their feet grew thick with calluses, tough enough to withstand thorns and stone. By adulthood, sensitivity had long disappeared. The ability to feel pain became a memory rather than a warning. It was this endurance that kept families alive, yet it came at a cost. The same strength that allowed them to walk through hardship also numbed them to it. They stopped noticing what hurt, and in time, forgot how to heal. Even when infection set in swollen toes, blackened nails, and open sore treatment was minimal. A cloth soaked in vinegar, a prayer whispered before sleep, and the hope that it would not worsen. Many continued walking until they could no longer stand. The thought of rest was luxury. The thought of care, vanity. The cracks deepened, the pain dulled, and life went on as before. The feet remained hidden beneath long skirts, unseen by others and ignored by their owners. What was invisible was never considered unclean. They walked through their lives on wounded feet, mistaking endurance for strength. The cracks became part of them, proof that they belonged to a world built on labour and survival. Yet those same wounds carried more than dirt. They carried infection, weakness, and the slow decay of bodies worn thin. Still, no one questioned it. The feet were forgotten, and what is forgotten is rarely healed. But the same fat and herbs used to soothe the skin would soon find another purpose, one that reached beyond the body and into the realm of superstition. Hair removal in the medieval world was an act of discomfort disguised as cleanliness. The tools were crude and unforgiving, simple blades of iron, dull from repeated use, and often flecked with rust. There were no safety razors, no oils, no mirrors bright enough to guide the hand. The process was done by feel, in dim light, with instruments better suited for scraping hides than for touching skin. Cuts were inevitable, and infection followed easily. Yet, women continued to do it, believing that hair on certain parts of the body marked impurity or sin. It is grimly ironic that they sought purity through wounds that made them weaker. The association between hair and filth was deeply ingrained. Cleanliness was not defined by health but by appearance and morality. The body was seen as something to be controlled, not understood. For women, especially, smoothness was tied to modesty. Hair on the legs or beneath the skirts was considered unclean, a sign of animal nature that needed to be hidden. So they scraped it away with iron, broken glass, or sharpened shells. The act was painful, but silence was expected. The red streaks and small cuts that followed were treated as the price of decency. In households where hygiene was minimal, this ritual stood out as an act of strange devotion, proof that even poverty could be virtuous if it left the body marked by effort. The blades themselves were often handmade, fashioned by local smiths who also produced farm tools and weapons. They rusted quickly, turning brown with moisture, but no one saw that as dangerous. Rust was part of life. It covered everything from nails to pots. The idea that it could poison a wound was not widely known. After shaving, women sometimes rubbed ashes or vinegar over their skin, hoping to dry the blood and ward off infection. The sting was fierce, and the relief fleeting. There were no disinfectants, no bandages, only patience. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like scraping the skin with a kitchen knife and calling it grooming. The very act meant to bring cleanliness left the body dirtier in ways unseen. Some used wax or pitch instead, spreading the sticky mixture over the hair and pulling it away in strips. The pain was worse, but the result lasted longer. Those with more money imported resin from distant lands, softening it over the fire before applying it. For the poor, the only option was the blade. They used it again and again, sometimes for years, until it dulled into uselessness. There was no sharpening stone gentle enough to restore its edge without breaking it. Each pass over the skin was a gamble between discomfort and disfigurement. Small wounds turned to scabs, scabs to scars, and infection hid beneath them. Still, they continued, because to stop was to appear unclean. Hair removal was also tied to superstition. It was said that hair held heat and moisture, that removing it kept the body pure and free from disease. Women who did not shave were whispered about as lazy or immoral. In some places, even midwives encouraged the practice, claiming it made childbirth safer. The truth, however, was more brutal. Shaving leaves the skin exposed to dirt and sweat, increasing the risk of infection in places already vulnerable. It was a cruel, ironic attempt at protection that invited harm. But knowledge was scarce, and imitation was survival. If others did it, so must you. For many, the act was done not in privacy, but as part of preparation for marriage or childbirth. Women groomed themselves in dim corners, with bowls of cold water and whatever blade the household possessed. The air smelled of metal and smoke, and the sound of scraping mixed with the slow hiss of breath held in pain. There was no mirror to correct mistakes, no softness to ease the burn. The result was often uneven, raw, and bleeding. Yet, when it was over, they felt clean, or at least closer to what they had been taught was clean. The ritual became a habit, a quiet obedience to ideas older than reason. Men were no different in their pursuit of grooming, though their methods were equally harsh. They shaved faces with the same dull blades used for livestock or tools. The cuts on their chins bled into collars, and the stubble that grew back itched beneath the dust of work. Infection and scars were common, but pride demanded endurance. To be smooth-faced was to appear civilized, even if the cost was pain. The same belief applied to women, though for them, the stakes were higher. A man's roughness could be forgiven, a woman's could not. Her smoothness was a measure of worth, her pain a measure of virtue. Those who could afford small luxuries used herbs or oils afterward to soothe the skin. Rose water, olive oil, or fat from animals was spread over the raw surface to soften the sting. The smell of blood mingled with sweetness, a strange combination of violence and tenderness. In wealthier homes, servants might assist, heating water and wiping the wounds gently. In poorer ones, women did what they could, grimacing in silence as the cold air touched freshly cut flesh. Each session left marks that never fully healed. Scars traced the same lines where blades had passed before. A map of effort repeated too often to remember. The infections that followed were quiet and slow. Small bumps became abscesses. The skin reddened and swelled, and sometimes the fever spread through the body. Without medicine, there was little to do but wait. Some pressed cold cloths against the skin. Others prayed. When the wounds healed, they left behind hardened patches that would tear open again with the next shave. the body learned to tolerate it, just as it tolerated hunger, cold, and labor. To be a woman meant to endure discomfort gracefully, even when it came from her own hands. The idea of beauty through pain is ancient, but here it found its most ordinary form. The women who shaved did not do it to please others alone. They did it because the world demanded it. After all, every lesson they learned taught them that being natural was being dirty. The metal blade, though rough and rusted, became a symbol of discipline, a way to prove control over the flesh. The cuts and scars were not mistakes, but badges of propriety. Beneath the layers of clothing, where no one could see, they carried proof of their effort to remain pure. They scraped away what nature gave them, bleeding in silence, believing it made them clean. The pain was a ritual, the infection a small sacrifice for acceptance. And though the wounds healed poorly, they continued, mistaking harm for hygiene. But the same iron that cut their skin would soon find another use, one that left far deeper marks than a razor could ever make. Among the strangest beauty rituals of the medieval world, few were as unsettling as the use of urine for the face. It was not a secret practice, but a known custom, whispered about and quietly accepted across classes. People believed that urine, particularly the first of the morning, carried purifying qualities. It was warm, pale, and seemed to emerge fresh from the body without visible impurity. Physicians claimed it could cleanse the skin, remove blemishes, and even restore youth. Women, desperate for smoothness and fairness, followed the advice with obedient precision. It is almost absurd that something meant for waste was turned into a symbol of refinement. The practice began with what passed for science in its day. Scholars and apothecaries studied urine as a diagnostic tool, believing it revealed the state of the body. Its colour, texture, and even smell were examined as signs of health. From this curiosity grew a belief that what left the body could also heal it. Morning urine was considered the purest, still untouched by the day's impurities. Women collected it in small earthen jars, letting it cool slightly before dabbing it on their faces with a cloth or cotton. Some washed directly, letting it dry on the skin like a tonic. The scent lingered faintly, sharp and sour, but was accepted as proof of its potency. Among the poor, this ritual was done in silence, often before dawn. Privacy was scarce, but embarrassment was even more so. They performed it quickly, wiping their faces before the household stirred, leaving no sign except the faint smell. Among the wealthy, however, the practice gained a strange legitimacy. Nobles and their attendants followed it openly, believing it a mark of sophistication. The irony was striking same act that peasants hid in secrecy became, in grander rooms, a ritual of elegance. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like using drain water as a luxury skincare treatment and calling it innovation. The boundary between science and superstition blurred until neither could be told apart. Physicians supported the habit with elaborate explanations. They argued that urine contained natural salts capable of drawing out impurities, that its warmth opened pores and balanced the humours of the body. In a world without true medicine, such reasoning felt convincing. Women noticed that their skin sometimes appeared smoother afterward, though it was likely the salt drying the surface rather than cleansing it. The faint tightening of the skin gave an illusion of youth, and illusion, in any age, is a powerful thing. Even those who doubted the practice often continued it, fearing that neglect might lead to dullness or discoloration. In the cold mornings of stone houses, the ritual became routine. A bowl or cup, placed discreetly on a table, waited beside a mirror. The act was personal, almost devotional. Some added herbs or wine to soften the smell, while others preferred purity, believing that alteration weakened its effect. Servants sometimes prepared it for their mistresses, straining and warming it before presentation. The act was spoken of delicately, if at all. No one called it what it was. They spoke instead of morning cleansing or restorative washing. The language masked the reality, as language often does when comfort must coexist with disgust. The smell clung faintly to clothing and hands, though perfumes and herbs were used to disguise it. In crowded rooms, the faint ammonia scent mingled with powders and oils, creating an aroma that no one questioned openly. To mention it was impolite, yet everyone knew. The hypocrisy of refinement ran deep. Who could afford luxury found beauty in what the poor would have been mocked for. There is something deeply human about how easily shame turns into pride when wealth wraps itself around it. Urine became another mark of devotion to appearance, another way to chase perfection through absurdity. The habit spread through the courts of Europe, travelling alongside other misguided treatments. Recipes for urine masks appeared in handwritten collections, alongside ointments made of honey, vinegar, and lead. Some women left the liquid on their skin overnight, believing the longer it stayed, the stronger its power. Others mixed it with ashes or milk to make a paste. Physicians praised its purifying spirit, while clergy remained silent, too accustomed to stranger forms of superstition. As with many things in that era, repetition turned disbelief into acceptance. Once enough people practiced it, it stopped being strange. Behind the polished manners and scented air, the truth remained pungent. Bathrooms as we know them did not exist, and sanitation was minimal. The same hands that washed in urine prepared food, dressed children, and handled prayer books. The liquid that touched the face often came from unclean vessels or was stored for days, fermenting in dark corners. The health benefits were imagined, the risks were real. Skin irritation, rashes, and infection were common, though rarely linked to the practice. When blisters appeared, they were blamed on bad spirits or on the will of God rather than on the treatment itself. The mind found comfort in ignorance. Women of every rank suffered quietly for beauty, united by the same obsession with pale, perfect skin. The standard of beauty demanded purity, and nothing seemed too extreme in pursuit of it. To them, the scent of urine was not filth, but sacrifice. Fair skin meant virtue, and virtue justified almost anything. They dabbed, rubbed, and waited, staring into mirrors clouded with candle smoke, convincing themselves that the face looking back was cleaner than before. The belief was stronger than the evidence. As long as their skin felt smooth, they saw success. The ritual endured for generations, passed from mothers to daughters as a secret of refinement. It became part of the rhythm of life, done in quiet rooms before sunrise and spoken of only in whispers. The few who refused were pitied for their stubbornness, told that they would age quickly or lose their colour. And so the practice continued, century after century, leaving behind no physical trace except the soft pallor of those who followed it faithfully. Even when better methods emerged, the memory lingered proof that desperation for beauty rarely fades with time. They washed their faces with what their bodies rejected, chasing purity through the very thing they feared. The scent of their efforts clung to them like an invisible confession, and though they called it cleansing, it was only another maskone that would soon lead them to even stranger remedies, where the search for perfect skin would trade foulness for poison. Hair in the medieval world carried more than dust and scent. It carried the illusion of cleanliness built on desperate invention. Bathing was rare, and washing the hair with water was rarer still. Instead, people turned to the dry things around them: flour, ash, and clay to rid the scalp of oil. These powders were sprinkled over the head, rubbed into the roots, and then brushed out with force. The motion sent a cloud of fine dust into the air, settling over everything in the room. When it was done, the hair looked dull but matte, a small victory against the constant sheen of grease. It is almost comical that people believed throwing dirt on themselves made them clean. The materials they used came straight from their surroundings: flour from bread making, ashes from the hearth, and clay dug from the earth were repurposed for hygiene. The logic was simple. These substances absorbed oil and odour, leaving behind a lighter texture. Women kept small pots of powder on their dressing tables, stored beside combs carved from wood or bone. In homes without mirrors, they relied on touch, rubbing the scalp until it felt dry enough. Then they brushed vigorously with combs that tore through tangles and scraped the skin. Strands broke easily, and flakes of powder fell like snow across their shoulders. The process gave the hair a strange, heavy scent of smoke and grain that clung for days. Water, when used at all, was applied sparingly. People feared it might weaken the body, especially if it reached the head. Physicians warned that washing the scalp could chill the brain, leading to fever or madness. Instead, the powder method seemed safe and effective without risk. For many women, it became a daily routine. They called it cleansing, though the truth was closer to concealment. The dirt stayed, trapped beneath layers of ash and residue. But to the eye, the shine of oil was gone, and that was enough. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like spraying perfume on a pile of dust and calling it fresh air. The illusion mattered more than the reality it hid. Combining materials created stronger results, or so they thought. Flour was mixed with ash to balance texture, or with clay to make it grip the scalp. The mixtures were coarse and left streaks of grey, which women covered with ribbons or veils. Wealthier women added crushed herbs for fragrance: lavender, thyme, or mint, but even those scents could not fully mask the smell of soot. The hair became stiff, dull, and brittle. Brushing removed some of the grime, but it also stripped away strands until the scalp ached. By night, the residue collected on pillows and cloth caps transfers to the skin and causes irritation. Still, it was better than the shine of sweat, which everyone considered shameful. The appearance of clean hair was tied to social order. Smooth, matte strands were seen as respectable. Oily ones were a sign of laziness. The wealthy, who could afford more powder, appeared cleaner simply because their dirt was better disguised. Servants reused the sweepings from their mistresses' tables, the same ashes already rubbed through another's hair. Each class imitated the one above, repeating the same flawed logic that beauty could be layered over filth. Hair was rarely cut short. Long locks were prized as signs of virtue and femininity, even when they were coated in residue and tangled beyond repair. The more difficult it was to maintain, the more valuable it seemed. Combs were important tools in this ritual, made from bone, wood, or even metal. They were used with both gentleness and aggression. Some women combed for hours, believing that the scraping motion would lift the dirt away. The scalp reddened and sometimes bled, but the effort felt meaningful. The strands loosened slightly, and the powder fell away, leaving behind hair that felt lighter. The satisfaction came not from cleanliness, but from control. They could not wash away the filth of daily life, but they could fight it in small gestures, handful of flour at a time. There is something strangely touching about how people convince themselves that ritual can replace comfort. In a world of limits, imagination became its own form of survival. For those who worked outdoors, the method was both practical and symbolic. Farmers and labourers had no time to bathe, and the dust of the fields blended easily with the dust they used for cleaning. Their hair smelled of smoke, earth, and grain, the scent of survival itself. The mixture hardened under sunlight, protecting the scalp from burning, though it also clogged pores and caused sores. In towns, merchants and artisans did the same, each adapting the habit to their means. A head covered in powder was better than one glistening with sweat, and so the ritual crossed every class and every season. The irony was that these powders often caused the very problems they were meant to solve. Ash and clay dried the scalp until it flaked, and flour attracted insects that fed on the residue. Lice thrived in the mixture, hidden between strands that had become stiff and coarse. Women itched constantly, but scratching in public was considered indecent, so they endured the discomfort silently. Some burned herbs in their homes, letting the smoke flow through their hair to kill pests. Others used vinegar or alcohol, which burned the skin but gave the illusion of purity. Cleanliness was not a state but a performance, rehearsed daily in dust and discomfort. Despite the effort, the hair rarely felt soft. It hung heavy, smelling faintly of wood fire and sweat, the scent woven into every strand. At night, when the powders loosened, the air filled with fine dust that settled on walls and bedding. Yet, this was the accepted order of things. The body was never truly clean, only managed. The women of that time did not imagine another way. They repeated what had been taught, believing it was enough. Their hair looked controlled, and in that control lay a kind of dignity. They did not see deception. They saw discipline. They powdered their hair with earth and ash, mistaking dullness for purity and dryness for health. The dust they brushed away each morning always returned, just as the need to appear clean never left. Beneath the surface, the scalp ached and the hair thinned, but no one spoke of it. Cleanliness had become an illusion shared by all, and illusions, once believed, were stronger than truth. Yet as the powders grew more elaborate and the recipes more strange, the pursuit of beauty would soon take a darker turn, one where the price of fairness was measured not in dust, but in death. In medieval households, cloth was a shared commodity, passed from one hand to another without thought or caution. Towels, rags, and washing cloths served everyone, women and children alike. A single piece of fabric might be used to wipe a face, clean a child, or dry dishes. It hung damp by the hearth or in corners of dark rooms, gathering the moisture and warmth that fed invisible life. In that humid stillness, fungi and mites flourished, thriving quietly where no one could see them. What seemed like a simple act of sharing a sign of thrift and care became a pathway for infection. It is almost tragically funny that something meant to keep people clean spread more filth than it removed. The cloth itself was a luxury, and every scrap was valued. Few homes could afford multiple linens, and washing them was work that consumed both time and water. Most towels were made of rough flax or wool, heavy even when dry, and impossible to rinse thoroughly in cold weather. When soiled, they were shaken out, not laundered. Dust, oil, and skin clung to their fibres, turning them into silent reservoirs of disease. A single towel could move through a household for weeks before being properly washed. By then, it carried the touch of every father after work, the mother after chores, the children after play. The intimacy of shared fabric made the home itself an engine of contagion. Illness began subtly. It started with itching along the scalp or between the fingers, small red patches mistaken for irritation from labour, but soon the marks spread across arms, down legs, along the neck. Fungus bloomed where moisture lingered, and mites dug into the skin, leaving trails of sores. People called it ghee, a word that covered everything from rash to rot. They blamed bad air, or witchcraft, or divine punishment. No one suspected the towel hanging by the fire, damp from use, warm from the hearth, perfect for nurturing infection. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like using a public towel at a train station for the whole family every day and wondering why everyone keeps getting sick. Yet to them, this was a normal, practical necessity in a world with too little to go around. The idea of personal hygiene, of separating what touched one body from another, barely existed. The home was communal, the bed shared, the water reused. Cleanliness was measured by effort, not by result. A woman might proudly wipe her child's face with the same towel she had just used on her husband, believing she was keeping them pure. The cloth was a symbol of care, not contamination. Even when rashes spread through families, no one made the connection. They treated the symptoms with herbs and smoke, never questioning the tools they used daily. The same damp fabric returned to duty each morning, carrying its hidden cargo from one day to the next. Washing was rare because it was costly. Soap, when available, was too harsh and expensive to waste on linens. Water had to be carried by hand, heated with scarce wood, and poured into large basins. After washing, drying required sunlight luxury few homes possessed. Most rooms were dim and enclosed, lit only by small windows or candlelight. Towels dried slowly, remaining damp long after washing. The scent of mildew and sweat became the smell of domestic life. No one noticed it anymore. It was the background air of survival. In larger households or monasteries, where dozens shared the same space, the problem worsened. Rows of towels hung in crowded chambers, each indistinguishable from the next. Servants passed them down without care, using them on multiple people in the same morning. Hospitals and bathhouses were no better. The very institutions meant to heal or cleanse were breeding grounds for infection. Patients left with their skin crawling, their sores spreading faster than before. Cleanliness was a performance, done for appearance rather than for health. The water shimmered, the towels looked white, but beneath the surface lived entire colonies unseen. Those who suffered from constant itching turned to remedies drawn from superstition. They burned rosemary or rubbed vinegar on their wounds, believing the sting meant healing. Some smeared fat mixed with ashes over infected skin, while others prayed or sought blessings from priests. The rich turned to perfumed oils, which masked the smell of decay but did little to cure it. The poor endured in silence, scratching until their skin bled. The cycle never ended because the cause remained hanging quietly on a wooden peg, waiting to be used again. In time, the rashes turned to scabs, the scabs to scars. But life went on. People grew used to discomfort, mistaking it for the natural order of things. No one imagined invisible causes. Germs were centuries away from discovery. Cleanliness was still a matter of faith. A spotless home meant one that looked tidy, not one that was free of disease. The towel, once a symbol of modest cleanliness, had become an instrument of slow suffering. Yet no one would have believed it if told. To question such a common object was to question the rhythm of daily life itself. The wealthy, too, were not immune. Silk handkerchiefs passed from hand to hand at feasts and gatherings. Guests shared them as tokens of grace, unaware that the same delicate fabric carried the same contagions. The difference was only in the quality of the cloth, not in the danger it carried. Even the Queen's court was not free from scabies and ringworm, though the afflictions were spoken of in whispers, disguised as rashes of the season. Pride silenced knowledge, and shame preserved ignorance. Cleanliness was about appearances, and nothing threatened appearances more than the truth of filth. To see one of those homes now would be to smell it, the damp cloth, the smoke, the faint odour of sickness clinging to every surface. Yet within that air lived love and care, mothers tending to children, wives caring for husbands, all with the same cloth that harmed them. It was not cruelty, but innocence, the kind that survives only where knowledge does not. The towel was both a comfort and a curse, its softness hiding what it carried. To those who used it, It meant home. They wiped away sweat, soot, and sorrow with the same fabric, never knowing what else they spread. The towel, once damp with warmth, dried stiff with the memory of 100 touches. It was proof that kindness without knowledge can still wound. But when sickness turned unbearable, when the itching became infection, people began to look beyond rags and herbs for answers, and what they turned to next would be far stranger than the sickness itself. In parts of medieval Europe where warm springs bubbled from the earth, public bathing was both a necessity and a spectacle. Few homes had tubs or private spaces for washing, so people turned to natural waters that steamed in the cold air. Women gathered together in these places, stripping away the layers that had clung to them all week: wool, linen, dirt, and fatigue. They bathed not in solitude, but in sight of others, surrounded by strangers who did the same. The springs were open, the air filled with mist, and the boundary between modesty and survival dissolved. It is almost darkly amusing that an act meant for cleansing left the body more exposed than ever. The water was rarely clean. It flowed through the earth, carrying minerals and warmth, but also everything that the bathers left behind: dirt, sweat, and oils mixed into a cloudy surface film that clung to the skin. Yet people believed it could heal. Physicians praised the waters for their purity and their divine origins. Priests even blessed some springs, declaring them gifts from God. Women came seeking relief from aches, childbirth pains, or simply the heaviness of living without comfort. To step into the heat was to feel briefly human again. The warmth loosened muscles and calmed the mind, even if the body was left dirtier than before. Bathing was communal because it had to be. A woman could not carry enough water or wood to heat it herself, and privacy was a luxury reserved for nobles. The springs, by contrast, were open to all who could reach them. Groups of women gathered at dawn or dusk, wrapped in cloaks that they dropped beside the stones. Their voices echoed off the hill slaughter. Gossip. Sighs of relief as they entered the water. Steam rose around them, blurring faces and hiding shapes. But the mist could not hide them completely. Men lingered nearby, pretending to fetch water or tend animals. Some watched openly, others from behind rocks and trees. The women ignored it when they could. To protest was pointless. To stop coming meant living without the only chance for warmth. The sense of exposure became part of the experience. Bathing was supposed to be purifying, but it also made women vulnerable. Their nakedness, once hidden beneath layers of coarse fabric, was now public property. Travellers spoke of the springs as curiosities, describing them in letters and stories with both fascination and judgment. Artists painted scenes of communal bathing, turning the women into symbols of sin or innocence, depending on who looked. The truth was far less poetic. They were simply cold, tired, and desperate for relief. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like a public shower in a freezing village where everyone bathes together under watchful eyes and still calls it rest. The heat of the springs did little to prevent disease. In fact, it encouraged it. Water never changed, only refilled. Dozens of bodies are soaked in it each day, leaving behind skin cells, oils, and wounds. Cuts reopened under the warmth, and infections spread easily. Fungus and parasites found perfect breeding grounds in the moist stone. People believed the heat could kill sickness, never realizing it helped it grow. The irony was brutal. The same water that promised healing often sent bathers home with rashes, sores, or fevers. Yet still they returned, because the comfort outweighed the fear. Pain was familiar, comfort was rare. Between the two, comfort always won. The moralists disapproved. Church leaders called public baths dens of temptation, places where modesty dissolved alongside grime. They warned that shared bathing led not only to disease but to sin. Sermons spoke of lust rising from the steam, of women tempting men through nakedness. In some towns, bathing houses were closed by order of priests. But the need for warmth did not vanish with the law. People went secretly, after dark, carrying small lamps or candles. The water became a quiet rebellion, a way to claim brief ownership of their bodies in a world that demanded constant restraint. There is something quietly tragic in how survival was mistaken for sin. Wealthier women bathed separately when possible, in rooms built above the springs, screened with thin fabric or wooden partitions, but even there, privacy was fragile. Servants watched, attendants entered, and rumours spread quickly. Bathing became both a necessity and a theatre display of health and beauty in a world that rarely allowed either. Some added herbs or wine to the water, hoping to mask the odour that clung to their skin after bathing. The scent of sulphur mixed with lavender and smoke, filling the air with something strangely holy and rotten at once. In colder months, the baths became meeting places. Gossip and trade flowed as freely as the water. Women exchanged recipes, herbs, and secrets, their voices rising through the steam. The warmth bound them together, turning strangers into companions. They spoke of husbands, children, and illness while soaking in the same water that made them sick. The contradiction was constant, but no one questioned it. Life itself was a contradiction, but striving toward purity, modest yet exposed, afraid of death, but drawn to what caused it. Not every spring was peaceful. Some were watched too closely. Others became places of harassment. Men crept close, laughing or calling out, knowing the women could not leave without shame. The sense of safety that the water offered disappeared the moment they emerged from it. They wrapped themselves in damp linen and hurried home through cold air, the wind turning wet skin to ice. By morning, the same women would cough and shiver, their temporary warmth traded for sickness. Still, the baths remained full. The desire to feel clean and alive for even an hour outweighed the risks. The springs steamed through every season, their surfaces rippling with laughter and fatigue. Children played at the edges while mothers tried to forget the weight of their days. For all their danger, the waters represented something pure small rebellion against dirt, labour, and cold. Even when the body paid for it later, the mind remembered the warmth. They stepped into the steam seeking comfort, unaware they were stepping into disease. The same water that softened their skin carried sickness deeper into it, and the same warmth that felt like mercy hid the beginnings of decay. Yet people kept returning, believing in the healing power of what was slowly killing them. And from those waters, where nakedness met faith and danger, would rise new ideas about purity, ideas that would soon reshape how society defined both cleanliness and sin. Bloodletting was once considered a cure for nearly every ailment, and in medieval times, it was practiced with a calm certainty that now seems terrifying. When a woman saw blemishes on her face or redness on her skin, she believed that her body was overwhelmed by bad blood. Doctors, priests, and midwives all agreed that the only solution was to release it. A shallow cut on the arm, a few drops drawn by a knife or a leech, and the body was thought to be cleansed. It was a ritual of pain disguised as purification, repeated in homes, bathhouses, and even monasteries. It is almost bitterly funny that people tried to cure sickness by making themselves weaker. The theory behind it was ancient. According to the medical teachings of the time, health depended on the balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When one humour became too strong, disease followed. Blood was seen as the most abundant and therefore the most suspicious. If the skin flushed or broke out, if a woman grew restless or faint, it was said that her blood had turned hot or corrupt. To drain it was to restore order. Some used knives or small glass cups heated over candles to draw the blood to the surface. Others trusted the slow patience of leeches, letting them cling to the flesh until they fell away swollen and dark. The sight of their own blood leaving the body brought relief, even if the weakness that followed was far more dangerous. In the homes of the poor, this practice was a household task. Mothers performed it on daughters, wives on husbands, each believing they were protecting their family from fevers and infections. A bowl of water, a sharp blade, and a scrap of cloth were all that was needed. The process was crude but sacred. A prayer might be whispered first, asking that the bad humours flow out. The cut was made quickly, usually along the forearm or behind the knee, and the blood was collected in a cup. It was wiped away with rags already used for cooking or cleaning. The wound was left uncovered to breathe out poison. No one thought of germs. They thought only of balance. Leeches were the gentler method, at least in theory. Apothecaries sold them in jars of murky water, promising purity and precision. Women placed them on their skin like living tools, watching them wriggle until they attached. The sensation was a mild sting, then numbness as the blood began to flow. When the leech released itself, the mark it left often continued to bleed for hours. People took this as proof that the treatment worked, that the impurity had finally been drawn away. The more blood lost, the greater the faith in the cure. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like treating a rash by opening a vein and calling the dizziness that follows a sign of healing. Logic never stood a chance against tradition. The wealthy practiced bloodletting as well, though with more ceremony. Physicians were summoned, bringing polished tools and cloths embroidered with crests. The act was no less brutal, only more refined. Afterward, ladies reclined in bed, sipping broth or wine to recover. Pale skin became a mark of health and purity, even as it betrayed anemia and weakness. To look delicate was fashionable, and bloodletting provided the appearance. The irony was that complete sickness became beauty, and beauty demanded sickness. The faintness of noble women, often admired in paintings and poetry, was in many cases simply the result of too much cleansing. Men and women alike submitted to the ritual for every imaginable reason: headaches, fever, sleeplessness, even melancholy. For women, however, the practice took on a deeper cruelty. Menstrual blood was already viewed as a form of natural purification, yet if a woman's cycle faltered or her complexion worsened, she was told her body had failed to purge itself. The answer, of course, was more bleeding. Barbers doubled as surgeons, cutting arms and legs while chatting casually with customers. The sight of red basins outside their shops became as ordinary as the smell of bread in the street. Pain was routine, and weakness a small price to pay for the illusion of control. The wounds often festered, knives were reused, sometimes shared among patients. Flies gathered around open cuts, and the rags used for bandages were rarely clean. Fevers spread quietly through towns, mistaken for unrelated illnesses. Women, already weakened by labour and poor nutrition, fainted easily or failed to recover at all. Yet when one died after a session, no one blamed the bloodletting, blamed the disease. The method was too deeply rooted in belief to be questioned. To doubt it was to doubt centuries of wisdom. In monasteries and hospitals, the ritual was almost religious. Patients lay in rows while monks moved from bed to bed with blades and bowls. They spoke of purging sin as much as sickness, linking the two in a way that made resistance feel immoral. Women seeking healing for skin or spirit endured the same treatment as the dying. The act of losing blood became symbolic of obedience, of letting go of pride and impurity. It was not a medical submission. Something is haunting about how willingly people hurt themselves when told it would make them good. Those who survived repeated bloodletting grew pale and thin, their immune systems fragile, their strength fading with every session. They mistook this weakness for virtue, believing their bodies had been cleansed of excess. But their wounds reopened easily, and their skin, once flushed with life, turned dull and grey. Infection left scars that ran like fine lines of shame across their arms and legs. The belief in purity had become its own poison. The practice continued for centuries, through plagues and wars. long after evidence showed its harm. It persisted because it fit so perfectly into the rhythm of medieval thought the world was sick. People were impure, and only pain could restore order. To suffer was to be saved. To bleed was to begin again. Those ideas were too comforting to abandon, even when they killed. They drained their blood to cure their ills, never realizing they were draining their strength instead. The basins filled, the leeches swelled, and the faces of the faithful grew paler with every attempt at healing. Yet still they believed, still they sought the purity that pain promised, and from this obsession with cleansing, the next chapter of their suffering would emerge not through knives or leeches, but through the crawling life that waited patiently beneath their skin. Parasites were the silent companions of medieval life, clinging to the folds of clothing and the fibres of bedding with stubborn persistence. No matter how clean a person appeared, no one was truly free from them. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs lived in every seam, every blanket, every hem. Clothes were rarely washed and rarely boiled, so the insects multiplied in warmth and darkness. The body's heat fed them, and the blood kept them alive. They crawled unseen, biting through the night, turning skin into a constant field of irritation. It is almost grimly amusing that people feared demons in the air, but slept peacefully beside the creatures that drank from their veins. Wool and linen, the common fabrics of the age, offered perfect shelter. Layers of heavy garments trapped not only warmth but also moisture and dirt. People believed that thick clothing protected them from disease, unaware that it also protected the parasites. In winter, when baths were avoided, the insects thrived. Each morning, women woke to the faint tickle beneath the skin and the small red welts that followed. Scratching brought brief relief but opened the flesh to infection, yet the itching became so familiar that most ignored it. It was part of being alive, as ordinary as hunger or fatigue. Only when sores began to weep or swell did anyone take notice, and even then, the cure was simply to wash or to wait. Washing, however, was rare and laborious. Clothes were soaked in cold water drawn from rivers or wells, beaten with sticks, and left to dry in the sun. In winter, this was impossible. Laundry froze before it could be cleaned, and garments stiffened into boards of ice. Weeks or months passed before the same shirts, dresses, and sheets were truly washed. In that time, the insects laid eggs by the thousands, tiny white specks clinging to seams and stitches. When warmth returned, they hatched again, beginning the cycle anew. Women brushed their clothing outdoors, shaking the fabric violently to send the creatures flying, but they always came back. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like wearing the same clothes for months and calling the scratching a sign of good health. Endurance replaced cleanliness, and resignation replaced care. The bedding was worse. Most people slept on straw or hay packed into coarse linen sacks. Over time, the straw broke down, turning to dust that mixed with sweat and skin flakes. This mixture became paradise for bedbugs, which hid in the creases and emerged at night. The sound of scratching filled the darkness, children, parents, servants battling the same invisible enemy. In the morning, the bites appeared in rows along arms and legs, red and swollen. Some smeared ashes or vinegar on the skin, hoping to soothe it. Others rubbed animal fat, believing it created a barrier. But the insects always returned. The body, no matter how wounded, was still their only home. Lice moved easily from person to person. A simple touch, a shared cloak, or a borrowed comb was enough. In crowded towns, where people lived shoulder to shoulder, infestation was inevitable. Women often braided their hair tightly to make scratching less obvious, though this only trapped the lice deeper. Men shaved their heads to escape the torment, but women were not permitted such relief. Hair was a mark of modesty and femininity, even if it hid colonies of parasites. Under the pressure of fabric and hairpins, the scalp became raw. Combings were a daily ritual. the teeth of the comb scraping through tangles while the insects fell to the floor, still alive and crawling. The faint sound of them being crushed beneath the shoe was strangely satisfying, though futile. Children suffered the most. Their skin, soft and tender, tore easily under scratching. Scabs turned to sores, and sores to ulcers. Without medicine, the infection spreads quickly. Mothers applied herbs or honey to the wounds, but these did little more than mask the smell. The same blankets that covered the children at night kept the insects warm enough to survive. The more the child cried and scratched, the deeper the problem grew. People learned to live with discomfort, to accept the constant itch as part of their nature. Pain that never stopped became a background hum, so constant that silence would have felt foreign. Among the wealthy, infestation was disguised but not absent. Velvet and silk offered no protection. The insects simply adapted. Servants brushed garments daily, beating the fabric with sticks to shake out the pests. The fine dust that rose in the air was filled with lice and eggs, unseen but ever present. Perfumed oils and powders were used to cover the smell, and noble women sprinkled their clothes with lavender or rose petals. They might not have seen the bugs crawling beneath their gowns, but they felt them. Etiquette demanded stillness, even when itching became unbearable. A lady could not scratch herself in public. Grace required composure, even while her body burned. Bedbugs followed even kings. Chronicles mention royal courts plagued by them, with entire chambers fumigated using smoke from burning herbs and sulphur. Servants slept on the floors, exposed to the worst of it, their bodies covered in bites that never healed. The line between palace and hovel vanished in this shared misery. Cleanliness was not a matter of wealth, but of luck and ignorance. Those who believed themselves pure were often the most infested, their perfumes merely disguising decay. The act of scratching became almost meditative. Women rubbed their arms against rough fabric or dragged their fingernails across their skin until it bled. The warmth of friction brought momentary pleasure, the illusion of control. But beneath that relief lay infection. Pus collected in small boils, red streaks crawled up the limbs. Yet even this was accepted. They called it fever, or bad humours, never realising it came from the creatures they carried each day. There is something painfully human about learning to live in peace with the very things that harm you. At night, when the candles went out and the room fell silent, the scratching resumed in unison. It was the sound of survival, quiet but relentless. In the morning, women shook out their skirts, brushed the straw beds, and began again. No one spoke of the crawling sensation beneath their clothes. It was too ordinary to mention. The parasites were not enemies, but part of existence itself. Tiny witnesses to a world that could not tell comfort from endurance. They lived, ate, and slept alongside the insects, mistaking the absence of pain for cleanliness. Their skin carried marks of struggle, small and constant, like handwriting from another age. Yet this quiet suffering was not the worst of what lived with them. Because beneath the itching and sores, another danger was growing, one that hid in the very air they breathed and the water they drank, waiting for its turn to claim their fragile bodies. In the medieval world, the pursuit of cleanliness often bordered on self-destruction. Without knowledge of bacteria or balance, people trusted whatever stung, burned, or smelled sharp to mean pure. Nowhere was this more painful than in how women cared for the most delicate parts of their bodies. With no true means of sanitation, they turned to the tools they knew: vinegar and alcohol. Both were common in kitchens and apothecaries, praised for killing rot and preserving food. If they could keep meat from spoiling, surely they could keep flesh clean. So women poured, wiped, and dabbed, believing that the sting meant success. It is darkly ironic that pain itself became the measure of purity. The logic seemed sound at the time. Vinegar was seen as cleansing because it dissolved stains and repelled insects. Alcohol, though rare, was known to purify wounds. physicians recommended both in their crude manuals, advising women to use diluted mixtures as part of their hygienic routine. Housewives followed those words with faith, mixing water with whatever they had: splash of wine, a spoon of sour vinegar, sometimes even both. The liquid burned immediately, but to them, that was proof it worked. The sharper the pain, the cleaner they felt. No one questioned the cost beneath the surface. The act itself was private and unspoken. Women performed it in silence, often before bed or after childbirth. They used linen cloths or sponges, sometimes the same ones they used for washing their faces. A bowl of liquid, a folded rag, and a brief moment of grim resolve were all it took. The first touch made them wince, but they endured. Cleanliness was a duty. The smell of vinegar filled the small rooms, mixing with smoke and damp air. To their husbands, it was the scent of virtue. To them, it was simply what had to be done. There were no soft soaps, no knowledge of microbiology, the eternal belief that purity demanded pain. The result was quite suffering. The skin grew dry, cracked, and sore. The natural balance of the body was stripped away, leaving a burning sensation that lasted for days. Many developed infections, though they didn't have the words to describe them. They spoke instead of inner fevers or evil humours. When the pain worsened, they repeated the ritual, believing the problem came from not cleaning deeply enough. The more it hurt, the more certain they became that they were purging something bad. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like disinfecting a wound every day with acid and mistaking the scar for healing. Their faith in discomfort blinded them to its cause. The ingredients themselves were harsh. Medieval vinegar was not the mild kitchen liquid known today. It was raw, strong, and acidic, brewed from spoiled wine or fermented fruit. It could corrode metal, strip dye from fabric, and blister skin. Alcohol was no gentler. Distillation was crude, leaving behind sharp impurities that burned upon contact. Some women used spirits mixed with herbs or honey, thinking sweetness might soothe the sting. It rarely did. The first seconds brought a chill, the next, a fire. Then came the dull ache of irritation that would not fade. Yet these sensations were accepted, even admired. The body's protest was taken as confirmation that it had been properly cleaned. This ritual cut across class. The poor relied on cheap vinegar, while the wealthy used imported spirits from Italy or France, sometimes perfumed with roses or myrrh. Noble women spoke of these mixtures as refreshing tonics, and recipes for them appeared in handwritten beauty guides. They dabbed delicately with embroidered cloths, believing themselves refined, though the result was no different from the peasants who used scraps of linen by the hearth. Cleanliness looked like privilege, but it hurt the same in every home. The only difference was the perfume. Husbands and physicians encouraged the practice, linking hygiene to morality. A clean woman, they said, was a virtuous one. Filth, even imagined filth, became a moral failing. Women feared not only disease but judgment. They cleaned to protect their reputation as much as their bodies. Pain became part of discipline, and endurance part of femininity. To complain was shameful. To suffer silently was graceful. There is something painfully human about turning obedience into ritual, even when it wounds. In their world, suffering was not proof of harm, but proof of devotion. Some women sought to lessen the sting by adding herbs or milk, but the mixtures rarely helped. Vinegar stripped away what little protection the body had, leaving wounds that festered quietly. The smell of infection mixed with the sour tang of acid, filling small rooms with the scent of both decay and duty. Yet, no one recognized the contradiction. To speak of pain in those places was indecent, so the suffering remained hidden. Women limped, sat carefully, and endured fevers in silence, praying that what burned would one day heal. Over time, these rituals became tradition. Mothers taught daughters without question. passing down the same instructions they had received. A clean woman was a good woman, and cleanliness was whatever made her hurt. The lessons were carved into memory as firmly as prayers. Even when better knowledge came centuries later, the echo of these beliefs lingered. People still trusted what stung, still feared what felt soft. It was as if humanity had learned to measure purity by how much the body could endure. The cruelest part of all was how invisible the harm remained. The skin healed over, leaving no scars, but inside, the damage deepened. Infections spread slowly, draining strength and dulling vitality. Some women grew pale and weak without ever realizing why. They believed their bodies were simply fragile, their suffering natural. Pain became their normal, and normal was never questioned. They washed away what they feared, believing the burn meant renewal, not ruin. The vinegar and alcohol stripped the body clean of comfort, leaving only the illusion of purity behind. Yet ignorance was stronger than truth, and so they continued, generation after generation trusting in the sting that promised salvation. But as the world grew dirtier and their bodies weaker, they would soon discover that what they called cleansing could also invite a far more visible decay. Hair washing was not a habit in the medieval world. It was an event, rare and inconvenient, treated almost like a minor ordeal. Most women washed their hair only once or twice each season, not out of neglect but out of necessity. Water was scarce, warmth was precious, and time was always owed elsewhere. Hair was meant to be kept under control, not cleansed. It was twisted, braided, or pinned tightly for weeks until the strands hardened with oil and dust. When the day for washing finally came, it felt less like care and more like a test of endurance. It is almost darkly humorous that something as simple as washing hair could turn into an act of pain and risk. The preparations began early. Buckets of water were drawn from wells or rivers and heated over open fires. The air filled with the smell of smoke and iron as the kettles boiled. There was no soap, no fragrant lather, only a few herbs or crushed flowers thrown into the water to soften it. Women undid their braids carefully, layer by layer, pulling apart strands that had become stiff with grease. The process released a faint sour odour, a mix of sweat and dust that had gathered for weeks beneath linen caps. Fingers snagged on knots, and every pull drew small winces. By the time the hair was ready, the water that awaited them no longer looked inviting but cruel. The washing itself was awkward and cold. There were no basins designed for comfort, only wooden buckets or metal pots. Women leaned forward, pouring water from jugs over their heads, rubbing the scalp roughly with their hands. Dirt loosened, then clung again as the water turned dark. Without soap, the grease never fully disappeared. Some sprinkled ashes or flour into the hair, believing it helped absorb the oil. Others rubbed the scalp with herbs like rosemary or mint, their strong scents a brief distraction from the odour of sweat. The motion was quick and mechanical. The goal was not luxury, but removal just enough to feel less burdened by filth. Afterward came the hardest part, drying. There were no towels soft enough to absorb moisture, and air drying in cold seasons was dangerous. So they sat near the hearth, close enough to feel the warmth but not so near as to catch flame. The air crackled, and droplets hissed as they fell toward the fire. The smell of wet hair mingled with smoke, creating a scent heavy and earthy, half clean, half burnt. But proximity was risky. Sparks leapt unpredictably, and the oiled strands of hair could catch fire in an instant. There were tales of women losing entire sections of hair to an unnoticed ember. Yet still they sat there, heads bowed toward the glow, their hair steaming slowly dry. Between washings, hair was never left loose. It was bound tightly in braids or buns, sometimes wrapped in linen or wool cloths to hide the grease. These coverings were meant for modesty, but they also trapped heat and moisture, turning the scalp into a small ecosystem of discomfort, sweat, dust, and oils combined into a layer that hardened over time. When the coverings were removed, the hair often came with them, tangled and stuck together. Combing it out was painful and slow, and when it could not be saved, women cut it. To lose hair was a small shame, but better that than enduring hours of tearing through knots. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like washing your hair only twice a year, then drying it beside a stove and calling it good hygiene. In wealthier homes, attendants helped with the ordeal. They heated water, brushed gently, and perfumed the hair afterward with oils or powders. The process was the same, only dressed in luxury. The powders left a pale residue that looked like dust but smelled of flowers. It gave the illusion of cleanliness, and that illusion was enough. Among the poor, the same process happened without grace or scent. A mother might wash her hair with the same water used for laundry or dishes, the basin already grey and greasy. When she finished, her hair felt heavy but dry, her scalp raw but satisfied. The act itself was what brought the sense of renewal, however brief. Men faced similar hardships. Though their hair was often shorter, they washed even less frequently, sometimes only when lice became unbearable. In monasteries, monks shaved their heads partly for religious symbolism, partly to avoid the nightmare of washing long hair. The circular bald patch of the tonsure was easier to maintain, easier to keep clean. Women, however, had no such relief. Their hair was tied to their identity, a mark of virtue and femininity that they were forbidden to cut freely. The very symbol of their modesty became their greatest burden. The belief that water could make one ill only deepened the problem. Many avoided washing entirely during cold months, convinced that water opened the pores to disease. A chill on the scalp was said to invite fever or madness. When illness followed, they saw it as proof. Superstition reinforced ignorance until the cycle became unbreakable. People lived surrounded by filth but feared the act of removing it. A clean head felt strange, even dangerous, to those who had known only grime. And yet, there was something almost comforting about their endurance. They accepted discomfort as a constant, weaving small moments of care into hardship. A comb drawn gently through tangled hair, a whiff of herbs rising from warm water were their luxuries. They did not wash to feel beautiful. They washed to feel human again, if only for an hour before the dust returned. They washed their hair so rarely that the act itself became a memory of struggle. The smell of smoke, the sting of tangles, the hiss of wet strands drying by the fire of it marked the rhythm of a world where survival came before comfort. They mistook endurance for cleanliness and danger for ritual, living in a fragile peace with their own decay. But even this ritual of water and fire would fade, replaced by stranger attempts to control the body, attempts that would leave the skin burning long after the hair had cooled. Clay was one of the oldest medicines of the medieval world, drawn straight from the earth and trusted like a gift from it. People believed it could pull out impurities, cleanse wounds, and renew the skin. Women used it not only for their faces but for the darker, hidden parts of their bodies' armpits, the inner thighs, and the groin. These were places where sweat gathered and fabric rubbed, where discoloration and odour made them feel unclean. To restore fairness, they pressed cold handfuls of clay against their flesh and waited for it to dry, convinced that the earth would drink away their blemishes. It is almost absurd that they looked to dirt itself as the cure for being dirty. The ritual was simple but far from gentle. Clay was dug from riverbanks or scraped from the sides of wells, thick and gritty. It was mixed with water until it reached the texture of a paste, then spread over the skin like a mask. When it hardened, it tightened and cracked, pulling painfully against the flesh. Women stood still for long minutes, enduring the strain, believing that each sting meant another impurity leaving the body. The surface of the dried clay often turned a darker shade, which they took as proof that it had absorbed their toxins. Then it was scraped off roughly with cloth or dull blades, leaving the skin raw but pale. The paleness was their reward. Pain and purity had once again traded places. For some, plain clay was not enough. Recipes passed through whispers, and old books advised adding ashes, vinegar, or salt to strengthen its power. These additions turned the mixture into something corrosive, burning the thin skin where it was applied. The woman winced but continued. They were told the burn meant healing, that beauty was a form of endurance. Ash added a fine grit that scrubbed away surface layers, vinegar bit into the pores, salt seared the flesh, the skin reddened, peeled, and sometimes bled, but that was considered part of the process. If one compares it to modern life, it would be like scrubbing one's skin with sand and acid to look refreshed. The logic was harsh but familiar if it hurt. It must be working. The clay itself carried unseen dangers. It was rarely pure, filled with small stones, soil microbes, and fragments of roots. Water used to mix it often came from the same wells that served livestock or sewage. Each application introduced new bacteria into freshly abraded skin. Infections followed, hidden beneath the illusion of cleanliness. When blisters or rashes appeared, people said the body was expelling more poison. Few realized that the cure was the cause. Still, the practice endured because results could be seen immediately. After the redness faded, the skin sometimes did appear smoother or lighter. That faint, temporary change was enough to keep the ritual alive for generations. The habit of drawing out poison extended beyond the body surface. Women used clay to treat everything from stomach pain to fever. They ate small pieces of it mixed with wine or honey, believing it could absorb sickness from within. Physicians encouraged the same practice, linking the skin's condition to the state of the blood. A pale, even tone was considered a reflection of moral and spiritual health. To let discoloration remain was to appear impure both inside and out. Thus, cleaning the skin became an act of piety as well as vanity. The smell of damp earth filled bedrooms and washrooms, a quiet scent of devotion and desperation. Wealthier women refined the ritual with imported powders. White clay from Italy or France was prized for its smooth texture and light colour. Mixed with rose water, it was said to whiten the skin without harm. But even these luxurious versions carried the same dangers. The pores clogged beneath the fine paste, trapping sweat and oil. The skin suffocated slowly, breaking out in small red bumps. Servants applied the mixtures obediently, unaware that the improvement they produced would soon require another treatment to fix. Beauty had become a cycle of wound and cover, damage and disguise. Among the poor, clay was gathered fresh from the ground, its colour depending on where they lived, grey near rivers, red in the hills. They had no rose water or imported jars. Instead, they mixed the clay with ashes from their own hearths, or salt scraped from barrels of fish. The smell was sharp, metallic, and earthy. They applied it in dim light, often at night after work, sitting quietly as the paste dried and cracked across their bodies. For a few moments, they could imagine renewal, as if the dirt of life itself might finally be lifted away. Then came the sting of removal, and the dull ache of skin rubbed raw. Beauty, even imagined, always asked for payment. The Church's teachings are intertwined with these rituals. Physical stains were likened to sins, and the idea of washing them away carried a moral weight. Clay became a tool of penance as much as cleanliness. Women who scrubbed until they bled believed they were cleansing their souls as well as their skin. The body, after all, was seen as the seat of temptation, pain purified, or so they were told. The darker the mark, the harder the scrubbing. In this way, self-inflicted harm disguised itself as holiness. There is something deeply human about turning punishment into devotion and calling it beauty. The results were fleeting. Within days, the discoloration returned, and with it, the old feeling of uncleanliness. No amount of clay could keep the earth from reclaiming its colour, just as no ritual could keep the body safe from decay. Yet the illusion of control mattered. To scrub was to act, to fight against the inevitable. In a world where so much was beyond their power, disease, hunger. Scraping the skin offered at least the comfort of doing something. Even when that something made the pain worse, they covered their skin in earth to chase an impossible purity, only to be left with wounds the colour of the soil they feared. The clay that promised to cleanse them did nothing but return them to where they began raw, aching and unchanged. But they would not stop. The belief that the earth could heal what life had damaged was too powerful to abandon, and in their search for purity, they would soon reach for even crueler substances that promised beauty while bringing destruction. The medieval idea of healing was often inseparable from harm. When the body erupted in sores or scabs, women believed that the only way to restore the skin was to scrape the sickness out. They did not wait for wounds to heal naturally. Instead, they reached for blades screwed, rusted pieces of metal sharpened just enough to tear. These were their tools of cleansing. Scabs were seen not as protection, but as prisons for illness, trapping corruption beneath the skin. And so, they cut. It is grimly ironic that their cure for infection was to invite it in. The ritual began with quiet resolve. A woman might sit by candlelight, a bowl of water beside her, and a thin knife resting on cloth. The blade was rarely clean. It might have been used to cut bread, shear cloth, or trim nails earlier in the day. No one thought of sterilization. The word itself did not exist in their vocabulary. To them, cleanliness meant only what the eye could see. When the knife shone faintly in the dim light, it was enough. The woman leaned forward, the smell of sweat and iron mingling as she steadied her breath. The first cut was always shallow, but the pain was sharp and bright. Then came the scraping, the dull pressure of metal dragging across tender flesh. There was no understanding of bacteria, no sense that the blood carried danger. What mattered was removing what looked unclean. Scabs were sliced away until the raw pink skin beneath was exposed, sometimes bleeding freely. Some even believed that the sight of blood was a sign of success, proof that the poison had been released. Others used thin razors, ancestors of the modern blade passed from one woman to another, dulling with each use. Infection was common but misunderstood. When wounds festered, they assumed it was because not enough of the diseased tissue had been removed. So they scraped again, deeper this time. Afterward came the soothing ritual that was anything but soothing. Fresh wounds were covered with ashes, crushed herbs, or heated leaves to draw out the remaining sickness. The smoke and warmth stung the open skin, searing nerve and muscle alike. Many wrapped cloths around the wounds, not to protect, but to hide the damage. The clothes themselves were rarely clean. Reused linen carried dried blood from older injuries, turning each attempt at healing into another cycle of contamination. The result was a skin mottled with scars, each one telling the same story of faith misplaced in pain. If compared to modern times, it would be like using a kitchen knife on an open wound, then pressing hot ash into it and calling it medicine. In wealthier homes, the ritual looked more refined but no less brutal. Noble women had small grooming sets, tiny knives, tweezers, and razors kept in decorated boxes. These instruments were polished but not disinfected. Servants assisted, their hands trembling as they obeyed. The lady would sit near a mirror, eyes fixed on her reflection, while the servant gently pulled at the scabs and sliced them free. A few drops of scented oil were sometimes added afterward, giving the illusion of care. The fragrance masked the smell of iron and decay, but not for long. Within days, the wounds would ooze again, hidden beneath layers of fabric and perfume. Among the poor, the same practice was done with crude tools, razor shards, broken glass, or even pieces of sharpened bone. They worked quickly, often without light, guided by touch and desperation. Pain was not a reason to stop. In fact, it was expected. They spoke of pain as something cleansing, a sign that the sickness was leaving the body. When fevers followed, they blamed the air, the season, or divine punishment, never the knife. The human need to explain suffering by anything except our own mistakes kept the cycle alive. These acts were performed in isolation, hidden from husbands and children. Shame surrounded illness, especially on a woman's body. A rash or sore could be seen as a mark of impurity, a physical reflection of sin. So they treated themselves in silence, carving away the evidence before anyone could see. The sound of the blade scraping against skin echoed faintly in the stillness of their homes. No one spoke of it, but the scars were common enough that everyone knew. Whole communities lived with the same quiet disfigurement, bound together by the same misguided trust in pain. Sometimes, the wounds never healed properly. They turned black at the edges, oozing beneath the cloth. The smell grew strong, metallic, and sour. Flies gathered. Those who survived learned to live with the scars, deep and puckered, running along arms, thighs, and necks. Others grew weak, feverish, unable to stand. Death from infection was slow and cruel, but in a world without microscopes or understanding, it felt inevitable. To them, the body rotted as it was meant to, and the knife had only hastened what nature demanded. Even when doctors appeared, they did not help much. Medieval physicians encouraged bloodletting and cutting as treatments for almost every ailment. Their tools were sharper, but their reasoning no wiser. Women were told to open the skin where the humours gather and let the sickness drain. They followed without question, just as their mothers had. The faith placed in those rituals was older than medicine itself, and far harder to cure. There is something strangely human about mistaking the endurance of pain for control. In a world that gave them little power, pain at least belonged to them. When the knife was finally set aside, the woman often sat in silence, dizzy from loss and trembling from fear. The wound stung beneath the thin cloth, pulsing with every heartbeat. She stared at the blood on her hands and told herself it was worth it. Tomorrow, she would feel better. Tomorrow, the redness would fade. Tomorrow, the body would forgive what she had done in its name. But the body remembered. They carved at their skin to erase what they feared, only to mark themselves forever with the proof of their struggle. The rusted blades, the ash, the trembling hands, they were all pieces of a misguided faith in pain as purification. And yet, as their wounds deepened, their rituals would too, moving from the blade to even crueler forms of cleansing, where the line between devotion and destruction would blur beyond recognition. Laundry in the medieval world was less about cleanliness and more about survival. Clothes were among the few possessions most people owned, and washing them was a task that demanded patience, strength, and endurance rather than any real understanding of hygiene. The concept of clean was visual, not biological. If a garment looked free of mud or grease, it was clean enough. Soap, as we understand it today, was a luxury few could afford, so women turned to what they had in abundance, ashes from their hearths. They mixed these ashes with water drawn from ponds, ditches, or the nearest stream, stirring until a grey liquid formed. Into this they plunged the family's garments, pressing and rubbing them by hand. It is almost laughable that the same water used by animals to drink and bathe was trusted to purify human clothes. The process began early in the morning, often before sunrise. Women carried wooden tubs to open yards or riversides, sleeves rolled high, hands already chapped from years of scrubbing. The air smelled of smoke, wet fabric, and decay. Ash, when mixed with water, released a faintly slippery texture. It was lye in its rawest form. The liquid bit at the skin, stinging small cuts and rough palms, but it loosened grease and stains well enough. They worked without gloves, unaware that the same alkaline mix that stripped the dirt from cloth also stripped the skin of its oils. By the end of each session, their hands burned and peeled, nails softened and broke. Yet this was the only detergent they knew, and the sight of rinsed cloth swaying on a line in the cold wind felt like proof of accomplishment. The water they used told a different story. Wells were rare, and public fountains even rarer. Most families relied on water from ponds or shallow streams that ran through villages. These same sources carried animal waste, rotting vegetation, and the runoff of slaughterhouses. It was not unusual for the water to have a greenish film on its surface, or to smell faintly of rot. Still, it was water, and that was enough. The poorest women hauled it in wooden buckets, each one heavy and sloshing. By the time they reached home, the sediment had settled at the bottom. They poured it carefully, thinking this would remove the impurities. In truth, it only hid them. Clothes were soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, in these improvised basins. The ashes slowly turned the water a cloudy grey, which the women mistook for effectiveness. The rougher fabrics, wool, linen, and hemp, absorbed the mixture deeply. Stains faded, but residue clung in the fibres. When dried, the garments felt stiff and powdery. They looked cleaner, but smelled faintly smoky and sour. The odour of ash became part of the scent of daily life, so common that no one noticed it anymore. If we compare it to today, it would be like washing laundry in a bucket of dirty dishwasher water and calling it freshness. The illusion mattered more than the result. During the colder months, washing became even harder. The rivers froze, and water had to be broken open with sticks or drawn from wells too deep for safety. Women warmed buckets near the hearth before carrying them out to scrub. The steam that rose from the tubs mixed with the smoke from burning wood, coating everything in a damp haze. Clothes were spread over bushes or hung near the fire to dry, filling homes with the heavy scent of wet wool. Moisture lingered in the fabric for days, turning the garments sour again. Mould bloomed silently in the seams. People believed this smell simply meant the clothes had been washed well. For the wealthy, the process was no cleaner, only more decorative. Servants boiled garments in cauldrons over large fires, stirring them with sticks while standing in clouds of steam. The ashes were replaced with imported soap made from animal fat and lye, sometimes scented with herbs. These soaps left the fabric soft but were costly, used sparingly, and never wasted on the servants' own clothes. The distinction between classes could be smelled as much as seen. Nobles' linens carried a faint aroma of lavender or rose, while peasants' rags reeked of smoke and river slime. Cleanliness had become another symbol of privilege. For ordinary women, laundry day was back-breaking labour that stretched for hours. Children helped carry water or beat clothes against stones to knock out dirt. The rhythm of the blows echoed through narrow alleys, a sound as ordinary as birdsong. Their backs ached, their clothes splattered with grey foam. Cuts from rough fabric stung against the lye, yet they kept scrubbing, muttering that the dirt must fear the hand. They rinsed garments in the same water until it grew thick with floating debris. When the last piece was hung, the water was poured back into the earth, forming puddles that animals soon lapped from again. The circle of contamination never ended. Even the act of drying carried hidden dangers. Clothes hung outdoors collected dust, ash, and soot from the smoky air. Indoors, near the fire, sparks sometimes leapt and burned small holes through the fabric. To keep garments white, some women spread them on the grass to bleach under the sun, unaware that insects and animals crawled freely across them. They shook off what they could, folded the rest, and stored everything in wooden chests lined with herbs to mask the lingering odour. The idea of sterilization was centuries away. Smell and appearance were the only measures of success. It is strange how easily people accept what looks clean as what truly is clean. Over time, the constant contact with ash and dirty water left its mark on women's bodies. Their hands cracked and bled, skin hardened into calluses, and joints stiffened from cold. Many developed rashes that never healed, and the mixture of lye and filth ate slowly at their flesh. But to stop washing was unthinkable. Dirty clothes meant shame, and shame was worse than pain. They worked through the seasons, through childbirth, through illness, driven by duty rather than hygiene. The irony was cruel. The effort to appear clean ensured they stayed in contact with the very dirt they sought to escape. The cycle repeated endlessly, generation after generation, ash and filth, rubbing and rinsing, wounds and pride. The garments they cleaned carried invisible life that grew stronger each time. When someone in the household fell sick, no one suspected the laundry. They blamed the weather, or sin, or bad fortune. Yet disease clung to their fabrics, sleeping within folds and seams, waiting for warmth and moisture to wake it again. They washed their clothes in filth and believed themselves purified, trading one kind of dirt for another without ever breaking free. The grey water and the burning ash had become part of their rhythm, their definition of care. But as the stains faded from cloth, they gathered elsewhere, in the skin, in the air, in the very idea of cleanliness itself, and from that illusion of purity would rise even darker practices, born from the same desperate need to appear untainted in a world that never truly was. In the medieval world, the most private moments were far from clean. Sanitation was not a matter of comfort but of improvisation. Without the concept of toilet paper, people relied on whatever nature or necessity provided. After relieving themselves, women reached for their hands, scraps of old cloth or tufts of grass pulled from the ground. There was no shame in it. It was simply how things were done. Rivers, fields, and wooden privies all served as places of relief, their smells familiar, their risks ignored. The act was practical, not secretive, carried out with an acceptance that filth was part of life. It is almost absurd to imagine that the same hands used to prepare food and tend to children were also the ones trusted to clean such things. The materials varied by region and season. In warm months, grass and leaves were plentiful. People plucked them from the ground, folded them roughly, and used them without thought. During winter, when the earth was hard and barren, they turned to rags or handfuls of straw. Poor women often tore strips from old garments too worn to mend. These scraps were reused until they disintegrated. Wealthier households had linen cloths, sometimes perfumed or rinsed, but they too were washed and used again. The idea of something disposable was unimaginable. Waste had value, even when used for something as unpleasant as cleaning the body. The places themselves were primitive. In cities, communal latrines stood over pits that rarely emptied. The air inside them was suffocating, the stench of ammonia and decay strong enough to make eyes water. In villages, people used fields, ditches, or riversides. Children played nearby, animals drank from the same water, and laundry was sometimes washed only a few steps away. Human waste was part of the landscape. The idea of contamination existed, but only as superstition. They spoke of bad smells spreading illness, but the real culprits, bacteria, were invisible and unknown. So long as the water flowed, they believed it was clean. Washing after relief was done with cold water drawn straight from nature. Streams and ponds were considered pure by default. Women squatted by the edge, rinsing their hands quickly before returning to their work. No soap was used. The chill of the water was thought to be cleansing enough. The same hands then kneaded bread, nursed infants, and combed hair. The repetition made it ordinary. No one questioned the cycle of dirt returning to food, of filth touching life. If compared to today, it would be like washing one's hands in the same water used for sewage and calling it hygiene. The danger was invisible, and invisibility meant safety. Diseases flourished quietly. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid claimed lives in numbers too common to shock. The symptoms, fever, vomiting, and endless thirst, were familiar signs of fate rather than infection. Families believed their suffering came from curses or bad air. In crowded neighbourhoods, waste overflowed from privies, seeping into the streets. When rain came, it carried the filth into wells and waterways. The poor drank what they had, unaware that each cup brought death closer. Doctors wrote of contaminated humours, blaming the body instead of the habits that poisoned it. Ignorance protected belief, even as it killed. For women, managing such filth was part of daily duty. They were responsible for cleaning the family's waste, scrubbing privies, or emptying chamber pots into the street at dawn. It was called the morning throw, a ritual so common that pedestrians learned to step carefully under open windows. The splash and smell were constant reminders that sanitation ended at the doorstep. To them, the world was divided not into clean and dirty, but into tolerable and unbearable. If a place smelled less than awful, it was considered fine. The bar for cleanliness was set low, and everyone adjusted to live beneath it. In the countryside, the routines were less constrained but no less dangerous. People relieved themselves in the fields, wiping with grass or earth. Farmers believed manure of all kinds, even human, could nourish the soil. They were partly right, though at a terrible cost. Parasites thrived in that same earth, entering bare feet or food grown nearby. Roundworms and tapeworms were so common that they were treated as nuisances rather than illnesses. Women often felt the pain of infection but endured it in silence, thinking it was part of a life's burden. Pain that did not kill was ignored. There was also a hierarchy to filth. Servants cleaned after their masters, emptying chamber pots and rinsing cloths without complaint. Their own hygiene mattered little to anyone. In noble homes, scented herbs were scattered across floors to disguise odours, and perfumed oils were dabbed on the skin to suggest cleanliness. The illusion worked well enough for those who could afford it. The poor, by contrast, had no such disguise. The smell of unwashed bodies lingered in their homes, their clothes, even in their sleep. They carried the scent of survival itself, raw and inescapable. Something is haunting in how people can grow comfortable living so close to what should disgust them. The repetition of these habits forged a kind of blindness. The body adapts to filth the way the eyes adjust to darkness. No one saw the dirt anymore. They saw life, its routines, its necessities, its small victories. A washed hand felt clean even if it wasn't. A rinsed cloth looked safe even when it wasn't. It was enough to believe it. Faith in appearance kept them moving forward through a world where true purity was unattainable. They lived and died surrounded by waste, convinced they were doing their best. They washed their hands in cold streams and called it cleansing, carried their sickness home and called it routine, endured the smell of decay and called it life. In a world where disease was constant, comfort came from pretending to be clean. But as the filth built up in their homes and in their bodies, another kind of danger waited, one born not from ignorance, but from fear itself, when even the thought of bathing became something to dread. Winter in the medieval world was a season of endurance, not of comfort. When the air turned sharp and the ground froze, bathing became a rare and dangerous act. Women feared cold water like they feared illness itself. To them, contact with chill meant death, and warmth meant survival. So they stayed wrapped in layers of rough fabric, sweating beneath wool and linen that had not been changed for months. Bathing was postponed until spring, or forgotten altogether. The smell of unwashed skin and damp clothing filled homes like smoke, heavy and constant. Yet no one thought of it as strange. It is strangely amusing that the same people who braved war and famine were terrified of a bucket of cold water. The belief in catching the wind governed their choices. They thought that washing stripped the body of its natural defences, leaving it open to evil air and invisible sickness. Even the faintest draught through a door was seen as a threat. So they wrapped scarves tight around their necks, wore hats indoors, and slept in their clothes. A woman who washed during winter risked not only judgment but genuine fear. If she fell ill afterward, it was proof that the wind had entered her body through her pores. The logic was simple and absolute. It was safer to be dirty and alive than clean and dead. Inside stone houses, the cold was constant. Fires burned low to save fuel, and the air smelled of smoke, damp wood, and human sweat. Steam from cooking condensed on walls, making them slick and dark. Beneath layers of fabric, the skin stayed moist and warm, a perfect ground for fungi and sores. Rashes spread across the body, under arms, between thighs, along the edges of collars, where fabric rubbed raw skin. The discomfort was relentless but familiar. They scratched until the skin cracked, then rubbed animal fat or ashes on the wounds to stop the pain. It seldom helped. The stinging was only replaced by numbness. Under their clothes, linen undergarments grew stiff with salt and moisture. The fabric turned yellow, then grey, and finally blackened at the seams. Mould crept across the cloth like a silent bloom. Women learned not to remove these layers except to shake out the worst of the dirt. Even then, they did it quickly, afraid of exposing the skin to air. In some regions, midwives advised against bathing newborn mothers or infants for weeks after birth, believing it weakened the spirit. The idea of purity had become inseparable from fear. If compared to today, it would be like refusing to shower all winter because the air conditioner might give you pneumonia. Outdoors, the rivers froze solid, their surfaces glinting like glass. Wells had to be cracked open with iron poles to reach the icy water below. Fetching it was an act of bravery in itself. Women carried buckets back through snow and wind, their hands raw and bleeding. The thought of using that water to wash was absurd. It was for cooking, not for cleansing. Even if a bathhouse existed nearby, it was seen as a place of moral risk, where bodies mingled too freely, where decency could be lost as easily as warmth. Public baths closed their doors in the coldest months, and many never reopened after outbreaks of disease. Dirt became not just normal, but virtuous. The smell of humanity lingered everywhere, in crowded cottages. The heat of bodies replaced the warmth of fire. Blankets absorbed sweat and breath, trapping the scent of life beneath them. To the medieval nose, this odour was familiar, even reassuring. They said the smell kept out sickness, that their own stench was a shield against the cold. I cannot help thinking there was a strange comfort in their ignorance, a kind of peace found in not knowing what harm truly was. When they finally undressed in spring, the first bath was both relief and torment. The skin itched fiercely as the dirt softened, revealing sores that had festered unseen for months. Bathing after winter was almost a ritual of rebirth. The water turned dark within minutes, carrying away layers of grime and dead skin. Women whispered prayers of gratitude and fear, thanking God for survival and begging not to fall ill. Their bodies were lighter, their clothes finally laundered, yet the cycle began again as soon as the next frost came. Year after year, generation after generation. The fear of cold outlasted every attempt at reform. The idea that water could cleanse and heal would not fully return until centuries later. They endured the filth because they believed it protected them, and in a way, it did. The stench and the layers, the grime and the fear, they were all defences against a world they could not control. Cleanliness belonged to those who could afford warmth and safety. For everyone else, survival meant embracing what was unpleasant and calling it wisdom. The line between comfort and decay blurred until it vanished completely. In that dim, frozen world, to be unwashed was not neglect but adaptation. They feared the wind more than infection, and so they wrapped themselves in filth and hope, trusting that warmth was worth any price. When spring finally thawed the ground, and rivers ran again, their bodies emerged from months of confinement, aching, scarred, and alive. That was enough. Cleanliness could wait for another season. The story of these habits closes where it began, in the small, dim rooms of women trying to stay alive in a world that never taught them what cleanliness truly meant. They bathed in ashes, feared the air, and mistook dirt for safety. Their survival was not elegance but endurance, and that endurance deserves to be remembered. Thank you for wandering through the forgotten routines of medieval women, where hygiene was a matter of faith rather than knowledge. Sleep now, and let the past fade quietly. Good night.